Welcome to a world where ancient voices still whisper through the winds. Step into the timeless stories of native tribes, filled with sacred rituals, powerful legends, and deep-rooted wisdom. Grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and prepare to walk the path of spirit, strength, and mystery. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your roots matter here. If these stories move you, give this video a like and subscribe for more sacred journeys. The drumbeat are calling. Let the journey begin. What if your ancestors followed a prophecy made of sound? What if your language had no word for goodbye because parting was never permanent? The Ojibwe are not just a people. They are a song that crossed rivers, a story that never stopped, walking today. They live in over 200 communities across the US and Canada. They've survived forced removals, boarding schools, and colonial law, and still speak to the spirits in dreams. They say the Ojibwe people did not begin with land, or fire, or even blood, but with sound. A voice rising from the waves of the great salt water whispered a path westward, long before the United States had a name, before maps carved up the forests and rivers into property lines. There were footsteps pressed into the soft earth. These were not just migrations, they were prophecies in motion, a journey not toward land but toward identity. The 7 fires prophecy lit their path. Each fire was a generation, a waypoint, a riddle to decode. Elders say the first fire warned of hard times, but also held a promise that if they followed the sacred shelf, magicianing in the water, they would find a place where food grows on water. So they moved, from the Atlantic coast, past the rolling pines, deeper into the heartbeat of the continent. The Medj's shell, glowing like moonlight on the surface of a black lake, was more than a symbol. It was a compass powered by belief. When elders held it in their hands, it wasn't just a shell. It was a voice, a memory, a direction passed down from the spirits who knew the shape of time. Some say it floated toward them as a sign. Others say it sank when they needed courage. But everyone agrees it called them west. This wasn't a single migration. It was centuries of memory braided through song and sky. Each step left behind more than footprints, it left stories. Songs carried on birch bark, dreams stitched into moccasin soles, teachings whispered over sweetgrass fires. And somewhere along the journey, a people became a nation, not through war or borders, but through listening. They listened to the land. The cedar trees taught them patience. The loons taught them to mourn. The wild rice, which swayed across glassy lakes in the morning light, taught them to wait, to wade, to harvest with care. Everything had spirit. Everything was relative. To take without offering meant you'd forgotten how to be human. Children learned language through water. Grandmothers taught by pointing at the moon. Uncles became second fathers, and cousins were more like shadows, always near, always watching. And then there were the storytellers, those who remembered everything, even the parts that hurt. Songs didn't belong to one person. Some were sung through cedar flutes made by lovers under full moons. Others were healing chants, poured like medicine into the bones of the sick. Drums weren't instruments, they were the heartbeat of the universe. And each beat was a pulse of resistance, even before they knew what they were resisting. Their Namonishneab means the original people, but to be Ojibwe meant more than blood. It meant memory, relationship, responsibility. It meant you knew the sacred shape of a circle and never built a fire without thanking the ancestors. You didn't speak to impress. You spoke because the words carried the weight of the ones who had already walked this path. At night, children curled against their mothers and listened to tales of the underwater panther who guarded copper and storms. They laughed at Nanabuzu, the trickster hero, who messed everything up just enough to teach a lesson. These weren't bedtime stories. They were blueprints for how to survive the world without breaking it. Back then, the world was full of sound. The hiss of cattails in the breeze, the pop of maple sap in spring, the snap of a fire in a cold lodge, while someone whispered a teaching that might save your soul one day. Nothing was wasted, not even silence, especially not silence. The people believed that stories had wings, that words, once spoken with truth, could never truly die. Even when those words were buried under mission schools and laws that criminalized ceremony, they fluttered like butterflies inside the mouths of children who'd one day remember. As the people moved inland, their language moved too, shifting, slightly like river currency, volving across communities, but never unraveling. Even today, Anishinabemo holds concepts English can't translate. Like Mino Bimadizi win the good life, not in wealth or comfort, but in kindness, balance, humility. To live it meant to always move in a way that left the earth better than you found it. But peace was not a shield. As settlers arrived, bringing fur trades, alcohol, and violence, the sound of the land began to dim. Treaties were signed in rooms with no windows. Promises were traded like pelts. Yet even as land was taken, something stayed rooted. The sound. The sound was not always music. Sometimes it was crying. Sometimes it was quiet resistance. A boy refusing to stop speaking his language in a boarding school. A woman harvesting rice even as machines tried to drain her lake. A grandfather lighting sage and praying over a highway where a child had gone missing. The sound didn't stop. It changed form. To be Ojibwe today is to still be part of that song. It's teaching children to say their names in their own language. It's protecting water as if it were breath. It's building language apps and holding naming ceremonies beside cell towers. It's knowing that prophecy isn't just a past, it's a direction. In many ways, they are still walking, still tracing the shell, still chasing the dream that one day all peoples will live in respect where no one owns the water and no one is forgotten. The story isn't stuck in the past. It moves forward into each new fire, because if you listen closely, you'll still hear it. The sound that became a people in a world before pencils, before clocks and satellites. The Ojibwe had maps made of memory. They folded stories into birch bark, scrolls weig, bark etched with symbols that looked like dreams and sounded like warnings. These were not decorations. These were contracts, prayers, and blueprints left by a people who trusted the stars more than the ground beneath their feet. A birch bark scroll could fit in your hands but stretch across generations. Rolled tight and hidden away in bundles of cedar, it held sacred songs, records of alliances, tales of migration, and healing chants older than any empire. The scrolls weren't just drawn, they were sung, carved during ceremony, passed on with the kind of care reserved for newborns and names. To understand one, you didn't need to read, you needed to remember. The symbols weren't meant to be obvious. They were layered, coded, guarded. A line wasn't just a river, it was a journey. A turtle wasn't just an animal, was time itself. To the outsider, they looked like curious drawings. But to the Ojibwe, these scrolls were living records. One stroke wrong and the meaning could vanish, like smoke over water. But while the scrolls held the memory of the earth, The stars told them where to go next. At night, elders pointed to the sky like they were reading a map made of fire. They didn't see constellations the way Europeans did. There was no Big Dipper, no Orion. Instead, there was the fisher Ajig who climbed into the sky to bring summer to the earth and now lives overhead, a streak of stars with a sacred past. The sky wasn't a place of escape, it was a place of guidance. They believed that dreams came down through starlight, that visions rode the backs of moonbeams, and that every person had a spirit twin in the night sky. Certain children were born with a kind of inner echo drawn to the stars, hungry for the teachings written above them. These children were taken under the care of shamans, taught how to see beyond what most people ignored. They were shown how to dream properly. The Ojibwe word Bawayagan means dream, but not in the way we use it now. A dream wasn't just a flickering of the mind, it was a message, a riddle, a spiritual responsibility. Some people fasted for days in the woods just to catch a single one. Others were gifted dreams without asking, but all were warned. If a vision came to you, you had to answer. If you ignored it, your spirit would wander. There are stories of men who were told in dreams to carve canoes from trees no one else dared touch, of women who were shown herbs in their sleep that could cure fevers, of warriors who saw the shape of their own death before they ever lifted a bow. These were not superstitions, they were systems, passed down through birch bark, stars, and silence, even today. Among families who carry the scroll traditions, it's not uncommon to hear someone say, "I dreamed this path before I walked it." Some call that poetry. For the Ojibwe, it's just truth. There was one story, carved in a scroll found in a waterproof bundle wrapped in deer hide, that told of a time when the earth would cry, when waters would choke on oil, and birds would fall from the sky. But it also said that in that time, young people would rise, that the birch bark would be remembered, that songs would be sung in places where silence had ruled for too long. That time, some believe, is now, because even though many scrolls were taken to museums or buried beneath shama, few survived, hidden under floorboards, smuggled across borders, whispered from grandfather to grandson until they were carved again, fresh into bark dot. And today, young Ojibwe artists, activists, and knowledge keepers are finding ways to resurrect them, not always with bark, but with tablets and code. One woman in Minnesota teaches children how to draw ancestral symbols using iPads and digital styluses. Another elder hosts nighttime skywalks, teaching Ojibwe star knowledge under suburban skies. It's not just about saving culture, it's about continuing a conversation that never ended, one that started on bark and moved into the stars, a conversation about who we are, where we go, and what we owe to the stories that made us. Birch trees still stand tall and white, like watchful ancestors. Their bark still peels in long, soft curls. And if you listen closely in the northern woods, you might hear the faint scratch of a stylus against bark, or a child's voice asking an elder, "What does this symbol mean?" And the answer might begin like this: "Long ago, under a sky like this one," because the story never really stops. It just changes form: birch to paper, fire to wire, star to screen. The scrolls may look different now, but the meaning is the same. We are still being guided. We are still reading the universe. They did not build empires of stone. They did not need marble or gold. The Ojibwe built their world from what breath: cedar, birch, willow, fire, and at the heart of it all stood the lodge. It rose like a half-buried sun from the forest floor, round and low, held together by patience, prayer, and the hands of women who remembered the old ways. These lodges Wejuam were not just homes, they were wombs of the earth. Inside, the walls curved like arms, and the smoke from the central fire spiraled upward in stories. The roofs breathed with the seasons. In winter, layered with bark and moss, they held back the cold. In summer, they opened to the stars. And always, the center fire burned, not just for warmth, but for memory. The hearth was sacred around it. Stories were told, children were named, the sick were soothed, and dreams were interpreted. The fire knew every secret. It listened without judgment. And beside it sat the women, the keepers of life, land, and legacy. In many Ojibwe clans, women held power in quiet, unstoppable ways. They chose where the lodge would stand. They decided when it was time to move. They raised the children, guided the marriages, kept the songs alive. Men might lead in battle, but it was the women who told them when to stop. Without their blessing, a warpath could not begin. Without their voice, no peace would last. The Ojibwe followed a clan system dudum, with each family bound by animal spirits: crane, loon, bear, marten, deer, and more. These weren't mascots, they were responsibilities. Cranes spoke for peace, bears healed, martens planned strategy. The system balanced power like a drum balances sound. And while men often spoke at councils, the wisdom of the women shaped every word. There were taboos, yes rules, that made sense once you knew the deeper rhythms. A Bear Clan man couldn't marry a Bear Clan woman. That wasn't just to avoid bloodline confusion, it was spiritual law. Breaking it would cause imbalance, like walking against the wind too long. And if you didn't listen, you'd find yourself lost spiritually and literally. In the lodges, young girls learned from grandmothers. They were taught how to read the wind by the way it touched a willow branch, how to read a man's intentions by how he carried his eyes. They learned the plants that could end a fever and the ones that could stop a heart. They didn't shout their power, they wore it, like moss on stone, quiet, steady, ancient. Moontime was not hidden or shamed, it was honored. When a girl first bled, it meant the earth had chosen her to carry stories in her blood. She would go to a moon lodge separate, sacred, where elder women would speak to her of pain, dreams, danger, and magic. These conversations did not happen in classrooms. They happened over boiling spruce tea and crackling fire under skies that knew too much. There was one elder who said, "We are not powerful because we are loud. We are powerful because we remember." That remembering lived in baskets woven from cedar roots, in lullabies hummed under pine trees, in the way a woman stirred soup or buried her placenta near wildflowers so the child would never forget where she came from, even during the darkest centuries, when missions came, when schools took children, when tongues were beaten. Silent it was the women who remembered. While men were often taken far, to war, to prison, to forced labor camps, the women stayed and kept the center warm. They buried their sacred bundles beneath floorboards. They carved lullabies into silence. They waited for the world to need them again, and that time is returning today. Ojibwe women are standing not just in lodges, but in courtrooms, in art galleries, at the heads of councils. Some wear ribbon skirts stitched with stars. Others wear business suits with beaded earrings. They fight pipelines, teach language, raise babies, and run tribal governments all in one breath. not because they want to reclaim power, but because they never truly lost it. If you walk into a modern Ojibwe home today, you might still see a round lodge in the backyard. You might see a fire pit with ashes from last night's story circle. You might hear a grandmother's voice saying, "Sit down, listen to the fire." It knows more than we do, because the lodge isn't gone, it's just changed shape. The circle still holds, the smoke still rises, and in that curling smoke, if you pay attention, you might glimpse the silhouettes of the ones who came before, women with eyes like embers, and backs shaped from centuries of holding a nation together. The story of the lodge leads us to another circle, this one painted on the skin, not built from cedar. It's the circle of paint, feathers, war cries, and the heartbeat of the drum. A circle that once rode into battle and now beats again in powwows and memory. They say dreams are where the spirit walks ahead of the body. Among the Ojibwe, this was not poetry, was law. A dream was not a passing shadow. It was a message, a warning, a path. To walk the dreaming way was to walk with the world unseen, where animals spoke, rivers whispered names, and ancestors pressed their breath into the night wind, long before a child could hunt or speak full sentences. They were taught to listen not with ears, but with spirit. A deer in a dream could mean a coming change. A falling tree could signal death. A song heard in sleep might become a healing chant. Nothing was random, nothing was wasted. In the dreaming world, every symbol carried meaning if your heart was quiet enough to hear it. The Ojibwe called it Bawa Uganda, dream vision. And for those who walked close to spirit, dreams shaped their whole life. A man might dream of an eagle, and from that day he would carry feathers and offer tobacco before every important act. A woman might see a bear and find herself drawn to healing, to herbs, to fierce protection. Dreams were not chosen, they chose you. Some dreams came soft, like a river's sigh. Others came loud, terrible, beautiful, shaking a person to the bones. These dreams sent people to the woods, alone, too fast, to seek answers. These were vision quests, or fasting journeys, where no food was taken, only water, sometimes not even that, just prayer, stillness, watching, waiting for the dream to come. For 4 days, they would sit in the forest or high on a cliff, speaking to no one, surrounded by silence, visited by wind and stars. They might cry, they might shake, but if the spirit was listening, the dream would arrive. And when it did, that vision would mark them forever. A boy might return a man, a girl might return with the song of her clan. A name could be earned in that silence, a purpose could be carved from it. Dreams also came to elders, those whose bones ached with memory. They were not just dreams of the past, but of what was coming. Warnings of sickness, hints of lost children returning, visions of storms long before the sky turned grey. These elders were respected not for their age alone, but for the weight of the dreams they carried. Medicine people, the Maidweedwin, were the dream keepers. Their dreams were maps. They kept sacred bundles passed down across generations, holding herbs, stones, feathers, bones, even the breath of those long gone. These bundles were not opened lightly. They were not trinkets. Each object within was placed there by a vision, and could only be used when the dream gave permission. The dreaming way was also how the Ojibwe navigated life's deepest turns: love, illness, childbirth, death. A woman might dream of her future husband and recognize him years later by the way he laughed or the color of his moccasins. A man might be guided to cure his child by a plant shown to him in sleep. Dreams were personal, yes, but they were also tribal. If a person dreamed of danger, the whole community listened. And yet, there were nightmares to spirits that came twisted, wearing the faces of lost loved ones or speaking in backwards voices. Not every dream was pure. Some were warnings, some were traps. To walk the dreaming way was to walk with power, but also with care. That's why tobacco was always offered before sleep, prayers whispered into the fire, and children taught too. Never ignore the quiet voice inside them, even in times of exile. When ceremonies were banned and languages beaten out of mouths, dreams could not be taken, they could not be outlawed. A child far from home, locked in a cold boarding school, might still dream of her grandmother's cooking fire. A man who'd lost everything might still be visited in sleep by an ancestor who reminded him who he was. Today, many Ojibwe still walk the dreaming way. In cities, on reservations, in hospitals, in courtrooms. Dreams still come, and those who know how to listen still carry them with reverence. In sweat lodges, young people are learning to fast again. At sunrise ceremonies, dreams are shared like bread, and the old songs whispered are being sung aloud again. Dreams are not fantasies, they are instructions. They are how the Ojibwe survived colonization without losing their soul. They are how they remember their place in the universe, not above nature, not below it, but within it. Every dream a ripple, every sleeper a star waiting to rise. And so, when an Ojibwe says, "I dreamed of you," it is not small talk, it is spirit talk. It is saying, "You matter, even in the world beyond waking." But dreams do not exist in isolation. They feed the stories, the rituals, the relationships. And from those dreams rose the way of life, the homes, the kinship, the laughter by the fire. The circle of everyday living, grounded in the sacred, the story of Ojibwe peace is braided with blood. For generations, the Ojibwe lived beside copper sacred metal pulled from the earth's oldest bones. In the Quinault Peninsula, long before any settler knew what lay under the red rock, the Ojibwe already carved copper into knives, trade beads, and ceremonial axes. They never took more than they needed. The copper was alive, spirit-born. It sang in dreams. It shaped diplomacy and defense. But the copper called more than the Ojibwe. In the 1800s, its gleam lured miners, soldiers, and settlers by the thousands. Greedy men, with maps in one hand and rifles in the other, dug into the sacred hills like they were nothing but dirt and ore. What had been a spiritual act became extraction. What had been balance became theft. The Ojibwe resisted not, just with weapons, but with stories, with treaties, with feet planted on the land like trees that would not move. Chiefs spoke in circles. Elders warned of dreams gone bitter. But the government came anyway, and behind it, companies with names that never spoke the Ojibwe language. The so-called Copper Warpath wasn't just a military campaign, it was a tearing of spirit. Battles raged in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Skirmishes flared along Lake Superior's jagged spine. Treaties were signed, then broken. Signed again, then burned in practice. One day, a chief would shake hands in Washington. The next, his people would find strangers cutting down their maple groves. The Treaty of La Puente in 1854 promised peace, but it came with poison. The US wanted land and minerals. The Ojibwe wanted to survive. The agreement carved out reservation. Land, yes, but It also demanded surrender of millions of ancestral acres. In exchange, the Ojibwe were told they could stay on their land only as long as they behaved. Peace, on paper. Subjugation, in reality. But peace did not quiet the copper rush. Mining camps bulldozed wild rice beds. Blasting shattered the cliffs. Where spirits once walked, children wandered forests that no longer recognized them. The copper warpath had moved from open conflict to economic chokehold. Some Ojibwe tried to adapt working in mines, marrying into settler families, navigating the strange world of treaties and property lines. Others resisted in quieter ways, holding on to ceremony, refusing to speak English, hiding songs in lullabies, planting medicine in secret groves. Still, the warpath continued in a new form. Policy, boarding schools were built to break language. Churches came to erase dreams. The government offered peace in the form of paperwork schedules, wages, forced relocations. And every act came with a silent demand: forget who you are. But the Ojibwe do not forget. From Red Lake to Bad River, from Mille Lacs to Lac du Flambeau, fires stayed lit. Copper knives were hidden away, not destroyed. Midwin medicine teachings went underground. Elders remembered stories of the copper giant's guardian spirits, who slept in stone and would awaken when the land was wronged. And the land was wronged again and again. Yet the Ojibwe held tight to something deeper than peace or war. The sacred promise that their people were not just of the earth, but part of its breath. This meant that even in exile, even in betrayal, there was a thread that could not be cut. In the 20th century, Ojibwe people began taking the copper warpath back, not with weapons, but with lawsuits, fishing lines, and language revival. Tribes sued for the right to harvest fish and wild rice, to hunt and gather on ceded lands, to be heard in courts that once ignored them. They won. And in those victories, copper glimmered again, not as wealth, but as memory. Today, if you walk the shores of Lake Superior or stand in the shadows of Michigan's copper cliffs, you'll hear something faint like thunder in stone. It's the sound of a people still standing, not defeated, not erased, just reshaped. The copper still runs through Ojibwe, hands not in mines, but in stories, in jewelry made by artists who honor the old ways, in drum circles that echo the heartbeat of survival. This was never just about copper. It was about the soul of the land and the right to exist beside it, without apology and peace. Peace was never a gift from the government. It was something the Ojibwe made for themselves, again and again, every time they chose to remain. The wounded peace still bleeds, but it lives. Some promises are made in stone, others only in snow meant to melt, to vanish with time. In 1837, under a sky heavy with change, the Ojibwe sat in council with men in coats too stiff and eyes too restless. These men spoke in legal words, foreign papers, and quiet bribes. They came with quill pens instead of weapons, but the wounds they left would take generations to heal. It was called the Treaty of St. Peter's. The government named it the White Pine Treaty, not for its truth, but for what they wanted from it. Lumber miles of pine forests that stretched like cathedrals across the Ojibwe homelands. The trees were sacred. They fed the fires, cradled the canoes, sheltered the birds, whispered to the stars. But in this treaty, the Ojibwe were told they would cede the land, not the life within it. They would keep the right to hunt, to fish, to gather wild rice, to walk the woods as they always had. These were rights, not privileges. The chiefs were promised rites that would last as long as the rivers ran and the sun rose. That's what they were told. That's what they believed. But that season passed. Almost overnight, axes rang through the forests. The rivers, once mirror still, grew clouded with sawdust. Settlers arrived like falling snow, quiet, persistent, unstoppable. Logging towns replaced maple groves. Trapping lines disappeared under fences. And soon, the Ojibwe weren't hunting deer. They were hunting lawyers, pleading for what had already been promised. For a while, the Ojibwe held on. Elders guided families deep into the woods to gather rice by moonlight, hiding from the men who now called it private property. Children were taught the lake's names in Anishinabemo, even as government agents brought English Shawnee rules. Ceremonies went underground. Rites became resistance. But then came Winter of the Soul, in 1850. President Zachary Taylor, with the stroke of a pen, declared the Ojibwe could no longer stay on the ceded lands. The promise of forever lasted 13 years. What followed was a brutal attempt to force them west, to erase them from their own forests. Many Ojibwe refused. In that same year, U.S. agents lured the tribes to Sandy Lake, promising food and payments. Over 400 Ojibwe men, women, and children died. There waiting, starving, freezing while government supplies were deliberately delayed. It was a massacre by neglect, and it lives in memory like a wound that never stops aching. The Ojibwe call it the Sandy Lake tragedy. It broke trust and nearly broke a nation, but still, the people did not leave. Chief Buffalo of the LaPointe Bandaman, already old, already tired, traveled by canoe and train all the way to Washington, D.C. He carried the names of the dead in his heart. He carried the hopes of the living on his shoulders. And when he stood before President Millard Fillmore, he did not beg. He reminded the president that the treaties were promises, that forever means something, that the Ojibwe did not vanish with the trees or with the first snow. They were still here, it worked. In 1854, a new treaty allowed the Ojibwe to stay in northern Minnesota. It created permanent reservations. It reaffirmed their rights to hunt, fish, and gather on lands they had ceded, rights that could not be revoked. But by then, many had already been displaced. Many had buried children. Many had learned that even the word forever could be reshaped by power. And yet the Ojibwe endured. They memorized the lines of the treaties like sacred prayers, passed them down word by word, held the government accountable again and again, in courtrooms, on lakes, with nets and rice paddles, and stories that wouldn't be forgotten. Some promises melt, others are carved into the spirit. The Treaty of 1837 was signed with hope and broken with greed. But what the Ojibwe carried from it was not defeat, it was defiance. A reminder that sacred agreement is more than paper. It is action, memory, a living thing. And as the treaties crumbled, the Ojibwe built something stronger. There are lines on maps that do not run through hearts. Lines that pretend to divide what the wind still carries and the blood still remembers. For the Ojibwe, borders came not from the earth, but from men who didn't know her language. When the United States drew its northern line, what we now call the US-Canada border, right cut across forests, rivers, and generations of Ojibwe land. It was a decision made in distant offices, carved with ink, not understanding that a people who moved with the seasons could not be fenced by flags. But the border came anyway. Suddenly, Ojibwe families who once hunted the same moose, fished the same lakes, and sang the same lullabies, were now labeled as Canadian or American. Customs officers appeared. Military posts rose. And for the first time, the land began asking for papers. But the people did not forget each other. On both sides of the invisible line, the Ojibwe kept visiting, trading, marrying, praying together. They passed tobacco bundles across checkpoints, whispered stories in Anishinabemo that neither soldier nor border guard could decode. A sacred river couldn't be claimed by any country, and neither could the spirit of a people whose identity was older than any nation. Still, the consequences of that line ran deep. In Canada, Ojibwe communities were pushed into a system of reserves under British colonial rule and, often too poor to farm, isolated from schools, hospitals, and jobs. They were governed by the Indian Act, a law that decided who counted as Indian based on blood quantum and bureaucratic math. Women who married outside their band lost their status. Children were torn from homes and placed in residential schools, where language was punished and faith erased in the US. The Ojibwe lived under the shadow of federal termination policies and broken treaties. Families were relocated to urban areas under the promise of jobs. Boarding schools stripped their language and culture. Entire bands were told they no longer existed in the eyes of the government. 2 countries, one pain, but the blood remembered there. Our stories of ceremonies held at night, where elders from Canada crossed into Minnesota forests just to light a pipe with their southern kin. Of rice harvests where cousins from across the line paddled in together, saying prayers that the moon understood even when the law did not. Of drummers who sang in dialects that had drifted apart but still found the same heartbeat. The Ojibwe refused to be split. If the government drew lines, the people braided ropes across them. One powerful symbol of this unity is the Grand Council of the Anishinaabe, ancient political and spiritual gathering that continues today. It unites Ojibwe from Michigan, Ontario, Minnesota, Manitoba, and beyond. Here, no passport is asked for. No ID is needed. Only the truth of belonging. The story of the border is not just about division, it's about resistance through memory. Today, Ojibwe leaders challenge national policies that try to define their identity. They've fought court battles to assert cross-border fishing rights, spiritual rights, and the right to belong to each other regardless of geography. Youth programs bring together children from both sides, reminding them they are not strangers but relatives. Artists stitch flags into quilts not to honor the border, but to show how it can be mended, because being Ojibwe was never about a nation-state. It was about the river you grew up beside, the song your grandmother hummed while picking berries, the smell of cedar, no matter what side of the line it grew on. And maybe that's what makes the Ojibwe story so powerful. Even when split by maps, they remained one people. Even when their names were mispronounced by presidents and prime ministers, they spoke to each other in syllables older than empires. Even when their homes were called Indian reservations or First Nations, they still called themselves what they always had, Anishinaabe, not American, not Canadian, just human, sacred, homegrown in the soil of both worlds. They called them schools. But the walls remembered screams more than lessons, and the beds remembered the tears of children who prayed to go home but didn't remember how to say it in English anymore. For the Ojibwe, the boarding school era was not just a chapter. It was a deep wound, carved into the minds of generations. A time when dreams were not just ignored, they were taken, dissected, and buried beneath church hymnals and military drills. It began with a simple lie: we'll educate them, we'll civilize them, we'll save them. But what followed was nothing short of cultural theft. Across both the United States and Canada, Ojibwe children, some as young as 4, were taken from their homes, sometimes with permission, sometimes in the back of wagons, with promises that didn't match what waited. Parents were told they'd return smarter, but in truth, many returned broken, and some never returned at all. The first thing they took was the name. Ojibwe children were given English names: John, Sarah, Thomas, names easier for white tongues to pronounce. Then came the haircut. Long hair, a sacred gift in Ojibwe tradition, was shaved off. With it, their connection to ancestors, to spirit, to pride, fell to the floor like shorn memory. Then came the silence. They were forbidden to speak Anishinaabe, the language of the lakes, the trees, the dreams. If caught speaking it, they were beaten, slapped, forced to scrub floors with toothbrushes. One girl recalled how she tried to whisper a lullaby to her sister in Ojibwe at night, and woke up with her mouth packed with soap. Food was rationed. Warmth was earned. Affection was conditional. Instead of stories and songs, they were taught shame. Instead of dances, they marched in rows. Instead of dreams, they were given dorm numbers and cold lessons about how to erase themselves. And yet, the fire did not fully go out. In secret corners, some elders in training hummed old melodies into pillows. Some traced the syllables of their true names into frost on windows. Some remembered just enough. The schools were run by churches, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, and funded by governments. But they were fueled by fear, the fear that indigenous culture could not coexist with the modern world. And so, the project became clear: kill the Indian to save the child. This wasn't metaphor, it was policy. Some of the most infamous schools, like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, or the Skinwalker Residential School in Ontario, became models for assimilation. Thousands of Ojibwe children passed through these institutions, and far too many died in them. Some were buried in unmarked graves, some died of disease, others from grief that rotted the body slowly, invisibly. The survivors grew up with silence in their throats. Many did not tell their children what had happened, not because they forgot, but because they didn't want the pain to live again. But pain does not stay buried forever. In recent decades, survivors have begun to speak, sharing stories at truth commissions, writing books, leading ceremonies of healing, and slowly, the world began to listen. In 2021, the unmarked graves of 215 Indigenous children were discovered on the grounds of a residential school in Kamloops, Canada. It was a shock, but not a surprise. Every Ojibwe elder already knew the ghosts were there. They had always been there. Today, Ojibwe communities hold healing lodges. They burn sage and speak the names of the lost in the language that once brought them joy. Youth groups relearn Anishinaabe. Songs once banned now echo through school halls rebuilt by the people themselves. And now, something sacred is happening. The very children of the children once silenced, they are singing. In schools built on their terms, with elders as teachers, with dreams stitched into regalia instead of uniforms. Because while the schools tried to erase, the people remembered. And while the past was shaped by pain, the future is carved by those who survived it. They thought they could take everything: our land, our children, our language, but they forgot one thing. We are the wild rice people, and wild rice only grows where the water knows its home. To the Ojibwe, wild rice isn't just food, it's a promise, a sacred prophecy. a gift that still bends gently in the marshes of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario, whispering to the wind that we're still. Here, in our language, it is called manumin, the good seed. It grows in shallow lakes, floating free, rooted in nothing but trust and memory. And like our people, it has survived every storm. There's a prophecy, the 7 fires, that told our ancestors to move west, following the shell of the turtle until they reached a place where food grows on water. And when they arrived at those shining lakes and saw wild rice waving like hands from the surface, they knew the journey had ended. The story had just begun. For centuries, the harvest of Manamin was more than a season. It was ceremony. Families traveled by canoe, whispering thanks to the spirits of the water. With 2 wooden sticks, called knockers, they gently tapped the rice into the canoe, never taking too much, always leaving enough for the birds, the fish, the future. It was work, yes, but it was also song. It was also prayer, and it was power, because Manamin fed villagers when no one else would. It saw us through winters. It filled our bellies and our stories. We named places after it. We passed it down like we passed down. Love quietly, but forever. Then the colonizers came, and they saw it only as a product, a crop to control, a resource to license, a plant to be patented, packaged, and sold. They drained the wetlands. They built dams that flooded the rice beds. They made maps that erased the lakes we called sacred. In Minnesota, Ojibwe families were fined for gathering the rice their ancestors had eaten for generations, fined for honoring a prophecy, fined for being who they were. But again, like Manamin, we didn't sink. In the 1970s, elders and youth began to push back. Court battles, public protests, canoe flotillas to defend wild rice beds. One tribal elder famously said, "If the man kills the rice, he kills the people. If the rice lives, so will we." Today, that spirit continues. Ojibwe tribes across the Great Lakes are fighting to protect manumin, not just as a food, but as a relative, a living being with rights of its own. In 2018, the White Earth Band of Ojibwe passed a law declaring the rights of Manamin to exist, flourish, and regenerate. Not a symbol, a citizen. Because the rice is not separate from us. It is our language, still floating. Our songs, still carried by the breeze. Our children, learning to knock gently, to give thanks, to listen, and yet, even today, the threat hasn't passed. Pipelines snake across Ojibwe territory, risking leaks into sacred waters. Corporations still try to create paddy rice, genetically modified versions of wild rice that grow in fields, stripped of spirit, but our resistance is stronger than their machines. Women lead the harvest dances, men paddle out at dawn. 2 spirit people, elders, and youth all return each year to the waters with one message. We are still the wild rice people, and wild rice does not grow in cages. The rice teaches us resilience, it teaches us patience, and it teaches us that the old ways, no matter how threatened, still matter. Because even if the schools try to steal our language and the laws try to silence our ceremonies, the rice still speaks. And in its voice, we hear our grandparents. In its stalks, we feel our future. A long time ago, power sat in a circle. No one was above, no one was below. The pipe was passed, the words were heard, and the people decided together. But centuries later, in a world of federal policies, casino lights, and government grants, the Ojibwe had to ask, how do we hold on to the circle in a world made of squares? Casinos didn't begin as symbols of wealth. They began as survival. After decades of broken treaties, stolen land, and government neglect, many tribes across the US, including the Ojibwe, found themselves boxed in economically and politically. Poverty became a shadow that lingered on the reservation, and then came a turning point. In 1987, the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of tribal sovereignty in the California v. Cabazon Band case. This decision cracked open the door. A year later, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act gave tribes the legal ability to operate casinos on their lands without needing state approval. For the Ojibwe, especially the Mille Lacs and White Earth bands, this was more than a business. It was a lifeline. Overnight, tribal casinos began to rise across the Great Lakes. What followed was a flood of revenue that was long overdue. Elders who once lived without heat now had homes. Tribal schools got rebuilt, clinics opened, roads got repaired. But with that prosperity came a new set of questions. Who controls the money? What traditions guide the choices? And in a world of slot machines and poker chips, where does the pipe fit in? The Ojibwe didn't abandon their values. Instead, many began to blend the old with the new. Tribal councils were formed or reshaped, democratically elected, but spiritually grounded. Elders still had a voice. The teachings of the pipe, the drum, and the fire were not pushed aside. They were braided into lawmaking. Slowly, but with intention, some councils opened every meeting with a prayer in Ojibwe. Some reserved chairs for elders who were not politicians but carried sacred knowledge, and in some rooms, the pipe itself was passed before the first vote. But not everything stayed peaceful. Money, as always, revealed cracks. Fights broke out, not just between tribes and governments, but within families, within councils, between tradition and modernization. Corruption crept in like fog. Outside developers offered deals that whispered promises but stole control. Some tribal members worried that casinos were becoming the new colonizer, glitzy, convenient, and eroding the old ways, one jackpot at a time, and yet others saw it differently. They saw jobs for their people. They saw land being bought back with casino money. They saw ceremonies funded, powwows growing stronger, and language programs that hadn't existed since boarding schools silenced them. One Ojibwe elder said, "We don't serve the casino. The casino should serve the pipe." It was a reminder that money is a tool, not a master. At the heart of all these struggles was sovereignty, the power to govern oneself, not just in paperwork, but in spirit. Not just the right to open a business, but the right to define what success means for a people today. Ojibwe tribes continue to walk this tightrope. Councils draft modern constitutions, but they do so while honoring teachings passed down in stories, not just statutes. Casinos build empires, but many still set aside portions of their profits to protect lakes, restore wild rice beds, and fund ceremonies. And the pipe, carved long before colonization, still passes from hand to hand. Its smoke carries prayers upward. Its bowl holds not tobacco alone, but the weight of generations. This is the Ojibwe way, to walk in both worlds, with moccasins in one and boots in the other, but with the same heartbeat under both. Listen closely, in the rustle of birch leaves, in the hush of falling snow, in the hush between drum beats, there is still a voice. It speaks of ancestors, of rivers that remember, of names whispered into cradleboards and into the sky. That voice is Ojibwa Muin, the language that refuses to die. At one point, Over 200,000 people spoke it. It flowed through Canada and the northern United States, from the Great Lakes to the northern plains. It was a language of complex verbs, vivid images, and breathy sounds that carried the heartbeat of a worldview. One where everything had spirit, everything had relationship, everything had consequence. But then came silence, boarding schools, missionaries, government bans. Decade after decade, Ojibwe children were beaten for speaking their language. Their mouths were washed with soap. They were forced to write in English, dream in English, cry in English, and still, in secret corners of kitchens and over nighttime fires, the language held on. Not loud, but low. Not in books, but in lullabies, funeral prayers, and the way grandmothers called to the geese. By the 1970s, many had declared Ojibwe when dying or already dead. But the language disagreed. A quiet revolution began, one not fought with guns, but with syllables. Elders who had been silenced began teaching again. Young parents asked to learn the words their grandparents had been punished for. In tribal colleges, immersion schools, and even YouTube channels, Ojibwe phrases came back like spring grass after snow melt. Some began writing songs again in the old tongue. Some coded language apps. Others printed children's books where bears spoke Ojibwe and turtles told ancient tales. One fluent speaker, Margaret Newton, said it best: "When we speak our language, we're not just translating English. We're restoring a way of seeing the world. And in that way, every sentence is resistance. Every word is a root. There's no word in Ojibwe for owning the land. But there are 10 different ways to say moving with the river. There is no word for conquer, but there are ancient verbs for honor the spirit of what feeds you. That is why this language matters, because it doesn't just preserve culture, it is the culture. And still, it's not easy. Fluency is rare. Many speakers are elders, and each funeral feels like a library burning. Children raised with the language are still the exception, not the rule. But across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Canada, the seeds are being planted again. Ojibwe immersion schools now exist where math is taught, not with textbooks, but with drum beats and syllables. Some families commit to speaking only Ojibwe at home, in prisons and on reservations, in city apartments and forest cabins. The language flickers small but fierce. Even the stars haven't forgotten. Ojibwe constellations are being the winter maker, the fisher, the sweat lodge in the sky. Children trace these ancient star maps on classroom ceilings, learning not just the words, but the worldview. The language carries medicine. It heals the silence. It reminds us that the people are still here, still speaking, still singing. This isn't nostalgia. This is survival. And in that survival, there is joy. To hear a toddler say buju instead of hello. To hear a grandmother's story told in the tongue she once had to whisper. To see digital billboards flash Ojibwe greetings above highways. This is how a people reassemble themselves, one word at a time. Not by forgetting, but by returning. Not by shouting, but by remembering how to speak the earth again. They said we were a people of the past. They said our stories were over, folded into textbooks, buried beneath treaties, footnotes, and silence. But they were wrong. We were never gone. We were seeds under snow. The Ojibwe speak of 7 fires prophecies passed down through generations. Each fire marked a turning point in our journey. Migration, contact, conflict, survival. And now we stand at the edge of the 8th fire. This fire is not of destruction. It is of return. It is said that the eighth fire will be lit by the people who remember, and the people who are just now remembering. It will be a time when indigenous and non-indigenous people come together, not through conquest, but through truth, healing, and respect for the earth. It will be the moment when choices are made to walk forward together, or to keep walking blind. That fire is rising new in classrooms where children learn to say Miigwech before they learn thank you. In legal battles where Ojibwe knowledge protects rivers and rice beds from pipelines. In elders who sing in the old tongue to newborns in hospitals. In water protectors who pray beside bulldozers. We are not a museum. We are not a chapter that ended. We are communities building broadband on reservations, running tribal radio stations, and coding Ojibwe language apps. We are scientists mapping sturgeon migrations, the way our ancestors did by watching the moon, the ice, the birds. We are lawyers who carry sweetgrass into courtrooms. We are artists painting constellations onto sneakers, and aunties organizing moccasin-making nights on Zoom. We are urban, we are rural, we are everywhere, and we are still Ojibwe. Our sacred Menumenwile rice still feeds us, not just in the stomach, but in the spirit. We still gather it with canoes and knockers, following the rhythm of a harvest older than any state line. It is not just food, it is prayer. Our drums still speak. They are not echoes, they are calls. Our lodges still rise from forest floors. Our stories still live on lips. Our language, once nearly lost, now flows in homes, schools, podcasts, powwows. We've buried too many. We've had generations taken from us through schools, prisons, drugs, poverty, but we've also watched generations rise, each one louder than the last. Each one more fluent in hope, more fluent in self. We are not broken, we are braided. And what does it mean to light the eighth fire? It means this, to walk gently again, to protect the water again, to remember that land is not owned, but loved, to know that survival is not enough, we must thrive, and we must do it together. Ojibwe prophecy says there are two roads ahead. One is scorched, one is green, and it is up to us which path is chosen. If the green path is taken, they say, a great healing will come, not just for our people, but for everyone, because the eighth fire is not just ours, it is a light that can guide the whole world back toward balance. So if you're watching this, wherever you are, know this, we were never gone. We were never lost. We were always here listening, waiting, rising, and now. We walk forward not just for us, but for the generations we have yet to meet, with drum in hand, with cedar smoke in our lungs, with language on our tongues. The eighth fire is lit, and it will not go out. They fought one of the most impossible wars in US history, minus 53 Modoc warriors holding off nearly 1,000 US soldiers from lava tunnels and volcanic trenches. They were exiled, betrayed, and their leader, Captain Jack, was the first native American tried and hanged as a war criminal. But the Modoc did not vanish. They adapted, they prayed, they returned. This is not just a story of war, it is the story of survival beneath the ashes. The land breathes here, not with the wind or the trees, but from deep within the earth. Under ancient skies and above restless lava, the Modoc people made their home beside the steaming mouth of Tule Lake and the jagged spires of the lava beds. This was not a place for the faint-hearted. The very ground could open and hiss. Caves whispered old warnings. And yet, for the Modoc, this was sacred terrain land, shaped not by fear, but by fire and spirit. Their ancestors didn't just live near volcanoes. They listened to them. They believed the mountain had a voice. And when the sun hit the rocks just right, you could hear the ancestors breathing through stone. Children were taught to step lightly, to never shout near the lava tubes. Some said spirits slept in the cracks, wrapped in obsidian like black mirrors holding memories. This land, though sharp and severe, held everything they needed. Tule grass for shelter, freshwater springs bubbling through basalt, fat salmon in the rivers, and in the higher ridges elk, deer, and silence so full it almost rang. Modoc women wove baskets with spider thread precision, while their men hunted with blades honed from cooled magma. But every act, be it fishing, singing, or planting tobacco, was tied to spirit. They believed nothing existed without soul. Even stone had memory. Even wind had feeling. There were no kings or castles, just families, tight and proud, led by wisdom, not wealth. Grandparents told stories that bent time. Children learned respect before language. And the most important knowledge didn't come from books, but from dreams. Dreams were not illusions, they were maps. Shamans, known as quaskers, walked between what is and what might be, healing with chants, smoke, and sacred roots pulled. From the breathless cracks in the lava to outsiders, the Modoc land looked cruel, barren, brutal, unwelcoming. But to those who belonged, it was a library of echoes, a church of stones, a classroom of shadows and light. They didn't just survive. They loved it. Each rock formation had a name. Each birdsong had a meaning. Every shift in the lake's reflection could be a sign. At night, when stars blanketed the cold sky and the fire pit crackled low, the elders would speak of Kumakomps, the creator, spirit who sang the Modoc into being, molding the mountains, carving the canyons, and placing the people right here beneath his breath. They were not wandering. They were not lost. They had always been here, born of obsidian and story. But that same silence that wrapped the lava beds like a blanket would one day betray them. It would be misunderstood, violated, a place of worship mistaken for a hideout, a spiritual world dismissed as savage. Soldiers would come, papers would be signed, promises made in soft voices would be broken with iron bullets. Yet that is not this chapter. Not yet. For now, the earth still breathes gently. The people still walk the ridges with bare feet and warm hearts. The songs still rise at dusk, and the old gods still linger just beyond the flicker of torchlight. In this beginning, the Modoc were untouched by the greed of maps or the machinery of empires. They were watchers of stone, whisperers of fire, keepers of dreams carved in rock. And while the mountain watched in silence, a boy sat at the mouth of a cave, staring into smoke, not knowing the path ahead, but feeling it in his bones, because the dream was coming, a vision that would guide a future leader. And it would come, as many truths did in Modoc life, not in war or words, but in firelight, in sleep, in the sun that kissed the stone. The Modoc people did not fear fire, they followed it. Before treaties, before rifles, before even the word Modoc was written down by anyone who didn't belong here, there were only the spirits. They moved through stone and ash, wind and water, always watching, always whispering. To the Modoc, the world was not just a place to survive, was alive, sacred, pulsing with invisible breath, and those who could see that breath, they were Quask, as the shamans, the firewalkers, the dream-readers. In the quiet darkness of the lava tubes, a child would be left alone for days. No food, no water, just smoke, stone, and dreams. This was a test not of strength, but of spirit. The child's soul had to wander. If the visions came shapes in the smoke, voices in the heat, then maybe the spirits had chosen them. If not, they would return simply as children again. But if chosen, they returned as something else, something in between. Shamans in Modoc life were not kings, but they were feared and honored. With songs older than any name, they healed the sick, spoke to the wind, called rain from bare sky. Some could curse, some could bless. They said the strongest among them could take your dreams, twist them, and return them changed. But there was always a cost. A true Quosk as lived in shadows, never fully belonging to the waking world again. Ceremony was not performance, it was survival. The Modoc believed that every illness had a spiritual cause, something stuck, broken, or forgotten. Healing began with chants that mimicked birdsong and fire crackle. The shaman's body became a bridge between this world and the one beneath. Sometimes they'd shake violently, speak in tongues, or bleed from the nose, as if the spirits were burning through them. But when the fire left, so too with the sickness. Sometimes animals too were messengers. The eagle brought vision, the coyote brought mischief and warning. The owl was death's shadow, but also wisdom if you listened close. Even rocks could speak, if you were patient enough. They remembered stories carved into them by time, not by hand. The Modoc didn't just see a river, they saw the spirit inside the river. They didn't just gather herbs, they sang to them before plucking. Nothing was taken without permission, and dreams. They were everything. Children were taught to remember every detail of their dreams. Colors mattered, numbers mattered. A mountain that moved, a fox with no shadow, a storm without thunder each meant something. Dreams were passed down, retold around fires, not as fiction, but as prophecy. Some dreams told you where to hunt, others warned of death. A shaman once dreamed of a pale cloud that smelled of metal and sickness. Years later, white soldiers arrived. Not all spirits were kind. Some wandered, some got stuck in places they didn't belong. There were tales of the ghost hands phantoms that would brush your skin in the night if you disrespected sacred land. There were dark caves where no one entered alone. Places where even the bravest warriors whispered prayers before stepping near. Modoc life was full of quiet rituals that outsiders never saw. They were not for show. They were for balance. And in the center of it all was fire. Fire cleansed. Fire told stories. Fire could kill, but also heal. During the winter solstice, great fires were lit and songs sent into the sky like offerings. The flames were not just warmths, they were mouths. They carried words to ancestors. The Modoc believed that when smoke rose, it carried your spirit a little higher. That's why every major ceremony, every healing, every farewell began with flame. But as the outside world crept closer, flame began to mean something else. It became resistance, warning. One day, it would mark the beginning of war. For now, though, the shaman's fire still burned freely. The dreams still came. The spirits still listened. And somewhere in the hills, a young warrior was walking with his vision still fresh in his mind. He had dreamed of stone turned red, of a trail soaked in shadow, and of a battle that would one day make his name echo across to nations. His name was Kinpwash, but history would remember him by a different name. They didn't build palaces, they built warmth. The Modoc made their homes from what the land gave: tule reeds, obsidian dust, pine smoke, and patience. No blueprints, no bricks, just wisdom handed down through firelit stories. Their world sat in the shadow of volcanic stone, where the wind could bite like a blade in winter and the sun cracked the earth in summer. And yet they built comfort. Their winter homes were dug into the earth like shallow wombs. Roofs were thatched with layers of tule and willow, sealed with earth to hold in heat. Inside, the fire was more than light, it was memory. The Modocs sat in circles, each face glowing, as elders spoke of animals who once talked, of children born under strange moons, of warriors who turned to stone. In summer, they moved into tule lodges lighter, open to the air, shaded like a bird's nest, built near lakes and rivers. These shelters breathed with the rhythm of the season. Children laughed in the reeds, learned to swim before they could speak clearly, and traced the tracks of elk along muddy paths. The Modoc world was never square. It was curved, flowing, alive. But a home was more than walls. It was the people. Inside, Modoc society moved with invisible lines, rules, older than memory. You were born into your clan, and your clan shaped everything: who you could marry, how you hunted, who would mourn when you died. Marriages were not just love, they were responsibility. A union meant the linking of families, of stories, of ancestors long gone but never silent. A woman might choose her husband, but her uncles would approve. A man could not marry within his own clan, it was taboo. A wound to the balance. Children belonged not only to parents, but to the village. If a child lost their mother, an aunt stepped in. If a boy's father fell in battle, the elders raised him with stories carved from his father's deeds. Elders were never left behind. They were the memory keepers. Their wrinkles were like maps of battles won and winters survived. They sat near the fire and spoke slowly, with words chosen like sacred beads. No one interrupted. No one dared. In their voices lived centuries. Discipline was not about shame. It was about correction. A boy who disrespected a hunt might be sent alone to sleep beside the water, to listen to the frogs and remember his place in the world. A girl who broke taboo might fast and reflect until the dreams returned. The Modoc believed in consequence, but they also believed in forgiveness. No one was cast out forever. Everyone was part of the circle. Food was family. Salmon smoked over open fires. Deer meat dried on racks. Roots, berries, and pine nuts were gathered with songs and shared with care. Meals were not rushed. They were ceremonies in themselves. To feed someone was to honor them. To eat in silence beside others was to say, I belong, and so do you. Trade was sacred, too. Modoc paths stretched far north to the Shasta, south to the Klamath. These were not just economic routes. They were arteries of culture, where songs and shell beads flowed like river water. Sometimes, stories were traded for obsidian blades. Sometimes, medicine for dreams. The Modoc were not isolated. They were part of a vast, whispering web, and through it all pulsed an unspoken law. Respect the balance. Take what you need, no more. Speak to the land before you touch it. Thank the deer before you kill it. Leave an offering at the spring. Carry your stories with care, as if your words were woven from pine smoke and starlight. There were no jails, no kings, no courtroom walls, only elders, stories, and the gravity of tradition. It worked not because of fear, but because of memory, because the Modoc did not forget. But soon, Others would come people who had forgotten, who believed lore came in papers, not stories, who thought fences made more sense than rivers, who would look at Thule homes and see poverty instead of design. And when those strangers came, everything built by hand and held by memory would be called primitive. Obsidian doesn't bend, it breaks into sharp, perfect silence. For the Modoc, obsidian was not just stone, it was memory, lightning trapped in volcanic glass. Forged in the depths of ancient eruptions, these black shards became their finest weapons. Spear tips, arrowheads, knives so sharp they could slice skin with a whisper. In the world of the Modoc, survival didn't come with loud glory. It came with quiet precision. They were hunters who moved like smoke. Barefoot in the basalt canyons, their shadows merged with the sagebrush. Every rustle meant something. Every broken twig spoke a message. They read the earth the way others read books, following deer tracks like sentences, finding meaning in a crushed blade of grass or the curve of a distant bird's flight. The hunt began long before the first step. It started with ceremony-painted faces, whispered songs, dreams interpreted by elders. If the dream was wrong, they didn't hunt. If the omens were twisted, they waited. To chase without permission from the spirit world was to court disaster. The Modoc believed every animal gave its life willingly, if approached with respect. A deer killed without prayer could curse the village with famine. A fish taken without song might silence the river. Their bows were made from juniper, shaped by fire and patience. Arrows were carved from chokecherry or serviceberry, fletched with feathers and tipped with obsidian. No two hunters carried the same weapon. Each one was personal, balanced like an extension of the soul. The best arrows didn't need to be fast, they needed to be true. Modoc hunting parties worked as one. No loud voices, no sudden moves, just hand signals and heartbeats. They would wait motionless for hours, blending into the land, becoming part of it. A cough could ruin the hunt. A single careless footfall could scatter the elk. So they learned to hold their breath, to slow their thoughts, to speak only with their eyes. When the strike came, it was swift. One arrow, clean and final. No chase, no cruelty. Then came the offering tobacco, scattered on the earth, words spoken to the spirit of the fallen animal. The Modoc never took without giving back. Even in death, the deer was honored like kin, and the kill was only the beginning. The animal was brought back with reverence. The meat divided carefully. Elders first, children next, then the rest. Nothing wasted. The sinew became cord. The hide was tanned for clothing, drums, and water sacks. Bones became tools, fishhooks, or flutes. Even the hooves had purpose. To throw away a piece of the animal was to break a sacred law. But not all hunts were for food. There were times when obsidian blades were carried into war, when enemy tribes threatened the borders, when raiders stole from the caches, when outsiders came closer with iron and fire. Then the Modoc hunted men not for sport, but for defense. They were not conquerors, but they were not cowards either. In those battles, the silence of the hunt remained. Modoc warriors did not scream into war. They moved under moonlight, weaving between rocks and ash. They knew their land like breath, where to hide, where to strike, where to vanish without trace. The lava beds were their fortress. To an enemy, it was a maze of death. To the Modoc, it was home. But their code was clear. Strike only when needed. Do not kill for pride. Do not fight for revenge. War was not glory, it was a wound that bled. On both sides, every weapon carved from obsidian carried a memory. It might have fed a child. It might have saved a village. It might have ended a life. But it always began in fire, shaped by hands that believed in more than survival. They believed in balance. And now, as we look back from a world of metal and noise, it's easy to miss the power of that silence. But the next time you walk through basalt canyons or sea-black glass glinting in the dirt, remember, somewhere a Modoc hunter once knelt there, listening to the wind, waiting with an obsidian blade in hand. Hearing what the rest of the world forgot, it is one thing to sign your name. It is another to do so while holding your breath, knowing the wind behind you speaks lies. In 1864, the Modoc were told they would have peace. They were promised food, shelter, protection. All they had to do was move. Leave their lava beds, their steaming lakes, their ancestral burial grounds, and cross the border into Oregon to live on a reservation alongside their rivals, the Klamath and the Yacht. In return, the government would honor them. The words came smooth, wrapped in silk and false smiles. But the treaty was written in two tongues, one swallowed, one swallowed. The one they heard said friendship. The one they didn't said surrender. Captain Jack, a young Modoc leader, felt it in his bones. He did not trust the paper. The ink was too dark. The faces across the table too pale. But what choice did he have? Winter was coming. The herds had shifted. The rifles were many. He put his mark down. And the silence afterward was not peace, it was a held breath before the storm. When they arrived at the Klamath Reservation, the Modoc were strangers. The land was not theirs. The Klamath viewed them as intruders, not brothers. Food was scarce. Fields were barren. Government supplies arrived, spoiled or not at all. The tension in the dirt grew like rot. Modoc families begged to return to their homelands. They missed the hot springs, the caves that whispered at night, the places where their stories were born. Captain Jack led a group back south to Tule Lake, to the lava beds to live free, outside the reservation. It was a quiet rebellion, a prayer to the land for forgiveness. The US government called it defiance. They sent orders, then soldiers, then demands. They told Captain Jack to return. He refused. They said he had broken the treaty. But how could you break something that was never whole, that had never been honored? From the Modoc view, the treaty was not lit, was betrayal wrapped in a handshake. They had kept their end. They moved, they suffered, they waited. The government had offered words and delivered starvation, promised respect and gave mockery. In Modoc tongue, this kind of lie had no forgiveness, and so the Modoc prepared not for war, but for defense. Captain Jack returned to the lava beds, that twisted maze of volcanic stone. With fewer than 60 warriors, he stood against hundreds of US troops, not to conquer, not to destroy, but to protect the land his people had bled into. For generations, what followed would become known as the Modoc War. But before the bullets flew, before the smoke stained the sky, it was this treaty, the one that cut with two tongues, that began the slow unraveling. One language said peace, the other built a gallows. And yet, amid the rising tension, there were still moments where trust flickered. Captain Jack met with peace commissioners. He asked for a home of their own. He said, "Let us live in peace on the land of our fathers." But the answer was always delay, always silence wrapped in formality. The treaty had said nothing about hearts, nothing about spirit, nothing about the children who would be born in exile. In Modoc tradition, truth was not a word, it was a bond. Something lived, felt, protected. The treaty, in the end, was never sacred. It was paper, fragile, unrooted. It meant nothing to the rivers or the stone, and so when it shattered, it did so loud enough to echo across history. It begins with fire underfoot and silence above. The lava beds stretch like a scar across the land, jagged, black, unknowable. To the US Army, it was a nightmare of stone. To the Modoc, it was home dock. Captain Jack stood barefoot at the edge of the stone fields, eyes hard with sorrow. His real name was Kienpus, but the world would come to know him by the name the soldiers gave him, a name sharp as gunfire. He didn't ask for war, he asked to live. But when no one listened, he made the ground speak instead. In the winter of 1872, after being hunted and harassed, for months, Captain Jack led fewer than 60 warriors, along with around 160 women, elders and children, into the lava beds of Tule Lake. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a sanctuary shaped by volcanoes and memory. A fortress carved by time. The ground swallowed footsteps. The air blurred direction. Smoke could vanish before it rose. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. But the lava made them invisible. The US Army, proud and armed with cannons, tried to force them out. But bullets disappeared into stone. Soldiers walked in circles. Ambushes came like ghosts from cracks in the earth. They called it the stronghold. But it was more than that. It was the last heartbeat of a people. Captain Jack's warriors did not fight like the army. They used the wind. They used shadows. They crawled through crevices, struck, and disappeared. For months, they held off over 1,000 troops. One general wrote, "The Modoc, with perfect knowledge of the country, with skill in its use and desperation in their cause, have made cowards of the bravest." But it was not rage that made them strong, it was grief. Every shot they fired was a cry for what had been stolen: land, dignity, the right to raise children under the sun that had raised their ancestors. And yet Captain Jack still sought peace. In the midst of war, he agreed to peace talks. He sat in meetings. He listened to generals. But one demand always returned: surrender. The government refused to give the Modoc their own land. They told Captain Jack to return to the Klamath Reservation, to be ruled by those who had never welcomed them. The Modoc Council grew divided. Some pressured Jack to kill the peace commissioners, to prove strength, to end negotiations once and for all. Jack hesitated. He wanted peace, not blood. But in April 1873, surrounded by doubt and anger, he gave in. During a peace meeting, under a white flag, Captain Jack shot General Edward Canby, the highest-ranking officer ever killed in an Indian war. The government responded with fury. More troops, more guns. The siege tightened. Starvation crept in. The lava, once protection, became a trap. Still, the Modoc did not run. They slipped through cracks, hid in caves, resisted capture with the cunning of wolves. But betrayal would come not from the enemy, but from within. A Modoc warrior, desperate to save his own family, gave up Jack's location. On June 1st, 1873, Captain Jack was captured. He stood with pride at his trial, wrapped in a coat given to him by a soldier. He did not beg, he did not curse, he said little. But those who saw him remembered his calm, the silence of a man who had already died when his homeland was lost. In October of that year, Captain Jack was hanged, along with 3 others. Before the rope tightened, he looked skyward and said, "I am ready." The army shipped his body east, never returning it to Modoc land. Even in death, they feared him, but he had already become something else, not just a warrior, but a symbol of resistance, of refusal, of what happens when a treaty breaks the back of a people, and the land becomes their last weapon. The lava beds remain, silent, dark, eternal, and if you walk them, you might hear echoes, footsteps a whisper through stone. We were here, and we did not bow. It was not a battlefield that claimed him, not a warrior's fall in the lava beds, but a rope thick, quiet, and final. On October 3rd, 1873, the United States executed Captain Jack, and in doing so, they tried to erase a symbol. But instead, they lit a fire. His real name was King, and he was not born to die in chains. He was born where volcanic cliffs shadowed shimmering lakes, where tule reeds whispered in the wind. As a boy, he watched fire dance in the eyes of elders. As a man, he carried the grief of a people cornered by lies. His story was not just of rebellion, but of heartbreak. After months of resistance in the lava beds, starvation broke the silence. More than bullets, families whispered prayers into crevices. Children were hidden in caves that swallowed sound. And then betrayal. A fellow Modoc, hoping to protect his kin, led the US Army to Captain Jack's hideout. The last breath of freedom ended not with thunder, but with a quiet surrender. He was taken to Fort Klamath and tried before a military court that had already made up its mind. The charges: murder of a US general during a peace negotiation. Captain Jack never denied it. But what he had hoped to explain the torment of being hunted, the hunger in his people's eyes, the refusal of justice was never truly heard. The courtroom was a stage, and Jack was the villain they needed. Savage, they called him. A murderer in beads and feathers, but he stood with poise. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with the quiet weight of a man who knew that no one would save him, not this time, not from this. They hanged him at 10 a.m. on a chilly morning, alongside 3 fellow Modoc warriors, Sean Chen, John, Black Jim, and Boston Charlie. Before the rope tightened, Jack looked into the sky and whispered something no one recorded. Some say it was a prayer, others say it was forgiveness. But those who watched said he showed no fear, only silence. The US government refused to return the bodies to their families. Instead, they shipped Captain Jack's severed head to Washington, D.C., where it was displayed at the Army Medical Museum. Not as a man, not as a patriot who fought for his people, but as a specimen bone and hair stripped of dignity. Decades passed, and the name Captain Jack was reduced to a footnote in schoolbooks, but among the Modoc, his name never faded. Grandmothers whispered it beside campfires. Children traced his path in the stone, and the lava beds remained a monument of black glass and grief. In time, historians would call him a rebel, a tragic figure, a symbol of resistance. But to the Modoc, he was something deeper. He was the breath they held when speaking of stolen lands. He was the shadow in the stone, the man who showed the world that even a handful of warriors, armed with only courage and the memory of their ancestors, could shake the strongest empire. And still, the wound lingered. What happens when your hero dies, not in battle, but under the noose of another nation's law? What does justice mean when the world sees your defenders as criminals? The answer is not in textbooks. It is in songs sung quietly, in children who still bear his name, in the silence of the lava beds where birds do not sing. Today, his descendants walk with heads high. Not because justice was done, but because memory survived. Captain Jack's soul did not hang that day. It slipped through the noose and joined the wind. But as the noose tightened around him, another truth began tightening around his people. Future of exile, relocation, and division. The warrior was gone, but the families remained, torn, scattered. They had survived bullets, betrayal, and the death of their leader. But what came next wasn't survival. It was erasure. In 1873, after the execution of Captain Jack, the US government exiled the surviving Modoc people, 155 men, women, and children, a 1,000-mile journey from their volcanic homeland in Northern California to the flat, unfamiliar plains of Oklahoma. They were not moved with ceremony or comfort. They were loaded into freight trains, like freight themselves. The land they were sent to had no caves, no sacred stones, no memory of their ancestors, just wind, just dust. It was not relocation. It was punishment. The Modoc were dropped in Indian territory, dumped into an alien world of other tribes, forced into dependency on unfamiliar systems. They were expected to farm in poor soil, to forget their old ways, and to become someone else. Entirely. No ceremony marked their arrival. No graves marked the ones who didn't make it. And yet within them, stories still burned. Women carried baskets woven with whispers. Elders remembered which plants cured wounds. Children, though hungry, still learned the names of stars in Modoc. But even so, something broke. The government called it assimilation. But for the Modoc, it was disappearance. Their dances were outlawed, their language suppressed, soldiers monitored. Their movement, Christian missionaries watched their homes. Their culture became a secret thing, whispered only at night, only in safe corners of the world. In this strange new land, marriages were stretched across sorrow. The Modoc who had once roamed the lava beds now lived in shacks. The hunters were told to be farmers. The warriors were told to be men of peace. Some accepted, some rebelled silently. Others simply survived. And yet, even in Oklahoma, the spirit of the Modoc flickered. When the buffalo were gone, they turned to deer. When their rituals were banned, they created coded gatherings. They taught songs as lullabies, disguised stories as bedtime fables. A mother might braid her daughter's hair and quietly hum a war chant from the lava beds. A grandfather might carve symbols into a wooden spoon, hiding the history where it couldn't be erased. But not all survived the transformation. Over the years, the Modoc faced relentless poverty. Disease came often. Education was forced. Their children were sent to boarding schools far away, stripped of their names, forbidden to speak their language. The silence of those classrooms echoed all the way back to California, and yet, remarkably, not a single generation let go of the name Modoc, even when the world told them they were gone. By the early 1900s, fewer than 24 fluent Modoc speakers remained, but they still spoke. And even in exile, a few elders told tales of lava rock that remembered footsteps and fire that never went out. In time, 2 Modoc communities would grow, one in Oregon, where a small band had been allowed to remain, and one in Oklahoma, where the exiles stayed. Separated by over 1,000 miles, they remained cousins in sorrow, joined by memory, not geography. The United States had hoped to dismantle a people. Instead, it created 2 branches of one unbroken root, and even in exile, the land called to them. Some Modoc elders in Oklahoma began to speak of returning, not to live, but to kneel, to touch the stone, to hear their prayers echo in the caves where Captain Jack once hid. By the 1970s, this idea became movement. Descendants of those who'd been exiled organized a journey back to the lava beds. It was not a protest. It was a pilgrimage. They carried ashes. They carried songs. And when they arrived, even the wind seemed to hush. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, in this bitter exile, the Modoc were asked to forget, and instead they remembered, quietly, fiercely, in soup pots, in lullabies, in the way. They never let the fire die out, even when the mountain was 1,000 miles away. And through this silence, a question began to form, a question that would define generations to come. If we no longer walk the land of our ancestors, are we still who we were? That question would haunt them through treaties, broken promises, and federal termination. But it would also ignite the beginning of their return. There are two places where the name Modoc still echoes, one rooted in the volcanic ash of Northern California, and the other tucked into the red soil of Oklahoma. They are the same people, split not by choice, but by war, exile, and the brutal arithmetic of survival. And for more than a century, they have lived on opposite ends of America, each holding a piece of a shattered whole. In Oklahoma, the Modoc lived in exile, descendants of those who resisted the U.S. Army in the 1870s and paid the price with their homeland. Stripped from the lava beds they knew as sacred, they were forced into reservation life, far from the spirits, caves, and stories that had shaped them for generations. Here, they learned to survive without the land that birthed them. They built new homes. They raised children in English. They ran tribal governments and organized annual meetings. Their strength became one of adaptation, of keeping the Modoc flame alive in unfamiliar air, but far away, in the shadows of Tule Lake and the jagged stone of Captain Jack's stronghold. Another story took root. While most of the Modoc were exiled, a small group, those who had remained neutral or had surrendered, early were allowed to stay in California and southern Oregon. This band was small, scattered, and watched carefully by federal eyes. They were Modoc by blood, but had to navigate a system built to erase them. In many cases, they were absorbed into the neighboring Klamath tribe. Documents misnamed them. Treaties overlooked them. But still, they remembered. They were the ones who could walk the same trails their ancestors had bled on. They could breathe the smoke of the same cedar trees. They could hear the wind through the same canyons where warriors once prayed. And for some, that connection was everything. Even if they were politically invisible, even if their numbers were few, they held a sacred geography roots that could not be pulled. And yet, when the two Modoc communities would meet at ceremonies, conferences, or national gatherings, something unspoken hovered in the air. A quiet ache, a difference not of heart, but of history. The Oklahoma Modoc were a federally recognized tribe, gaining official status in 1978 after decades of organizing, lobbying, and cultural resilience. They had casinos, councils, and land in trust. There, tribal government could sign documents, manage funds, run programs. They had the paperwork of nationhood. Meanwhile, the California Modocs, smaller in number, still merged administratively with the Klamaths, struggled for recognition. They had land, yes, sacred sites, memory in the stones. But they lacked the same political clout. The irony ran deep. The people who had never left the homeland were often treated as the less official MODOC. This invisible fracture raised difficult questions. Who holds the truth of a nation? The ones who stayed, or the ones who endured exile and rebuilt? Can a people split by war ever feel fully whole again? And deeper still, what does it mean to belong to a nation that has two hearts beating far apart? Despite the divide, moments of connection began to surface. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Oklahoma Modoc began to organize return journeys to California, just as tourists, but as children coming home. They walked the lava beds with reverence. They listened to stories told by local elders. They offered tobacco to the earth. In return, California Modoc welcomed them not as strangers, but as long-lost kin. One such meeting took place near the very rock where Captain Jack once hid. A circle was formed. Words were spoken. Tears were shared. Some said they could feel the ancestors in the wind. Others simply closed their eyes and breathed, letting the land speak its language into their bones. Slowly, something powerful began to form, that a merging of governments, but a healing of spirit. A recognition that both stories mattered, that exile and roots could exist in the same name. Today, the Oklahoma Modoc thrive with programs, tribal businesses, and youth initiatives. They carry forward their heritage in a world of technology and political sovereignty. Meanwhile, the California Modoc continue to fight for recognition, protect sacred sites, and speak the original names of mountains into the morning air. And, through it all, a shared understanding has begun to grow. They are not two tribes. They are one story written in two directions. The pain of the split remains, but so does the power of connection. Because a nation is not just made by borders or blood, it is made by memory. And both Modoc communities carry that memory like fire between their hands. They took the children in wagons, trains, and military trucks. They came for them not with kindness, but with scissors, soap, and silence. Their mission was simple: kill the Indian, save the man. And so began one of the darkest chapters in Modoc memory, the era of the boarding schools. Children as young as 5 were taken from their homes in Oregon, California, and later Oklahoma. Their braids were cut off, a sacred violation. Their clothes were burned. Their native language, Modoc, the breath of their ancestors, was beaten out of their mouths. Every syllable was a crime. Every prayer whispered in secret was a rebellion. Some were sent to Carlisle in Pennsylvania, others to Kamawa in Oregon, Fort Bidwell, Riverside, Chillicothe. The names of the schools still echo with dormitory ghosts and cafeteria shame. These places were not built for learning, they were factories for forgetting. The children were told they were dirty, savage, less than. Their culture was backward. Their gods were lies. And so, the forgetting began. They were given new names: John, Mary, Henry. They were forbidden to speak Modoc, even in whispers. If they did, they were whipped. Some had their mouths washed with soap. Others were locked in dark closets. Over time, many stopped speaking altogether. The silence was safer. But silence does not erase, it buries. And deep inside, many children carried their words like glowing coals, memory in hiding, fire under ash. Some escaped. Some ran home barefoot, hundreds of miles. Some never returned at all. Don't, for those who did survive, the scars came home with them, not just on their bodies, but in their dreams, in their parenting, in the strange ache they couldn't name. They had forgotten the songs, but remembered the shame. They raised children without the language because they thought it was safer that way. They believed that forgetting might be a kind of mercy. But the price was steep. By the late 20th century, the Modoc language had nearly vanished. Fewer than a dozen fluent speakers remained, most of them elderly. Recordings were scarce, written texts were fragmented. A people who once sang stories into stars now found their voice cracking under the weight of colonial silence. And yet ashes are not the end. They are the beginning of fire. In Oklahoma and California alike, Modoc leaders, linguists, and elders began to fight back not with weapons, but with syllables. They tracked down old recordings. They listened to wax cylinders in archives. They studied the grammar etched into notebooks by anthropologists who had once treated their culture as a dying exhibit. And slowly, word by word, they began to piece the language back together. You could see it in the faces of elders when a grandchild said their first word in Modoc. You could hear it in classrooms where songs were sung again. You could feel it in tribal offices where language programs were funded, lesson books printed, apps created. The digital world became a new kind of stronghold, lava bed, made of pixels and passwords. And while no one pretended it would be easy, there was a kind of joy in the struggle. To speak Modoc today is not just to use a tool, it is to light a torch in a place they tried to make dark forever. Every word is an act of return. Every phrase is an echo that refuses to die. It is not a fluent language, yet, but it is breathing again, in lullabies, in prayers, in classroom chalk, in text messages between cousins, in tribal meetings where elders smile through tears. We speak ashes, yes, but we also speak rebirth. And there's something powerful in knowing that the language almost died not because it was weak, but because it was feared, because the Modoc voice held something so sacred, so unbreakable, that even governments felt threatened. Now, as that voice rises again, it carries with it the strength of every child who was silenced, and every elder who remembered that Modoc once knew land as breath, not as deed. The lava beds were not borders but stories. The rivers were not property but pulse. And yet, after generations of exile, bloodshed, silence, and forgetting, it was not a chant or a dance that brought them home. It was paperwork. It was courtrooms. It was fire carved into law. The 20th century had pushed the Modoc people to the edge of cultural extinction. Split in two, one group exiled to Oklahoma, the other surviving in the cracks of Northern California. They had become strangers to their own history. Many tribal members grew up never hearing the word Modoc in schools. They were taught about George Washington, but not Captain Jack, about Columbus, but not the Lava Bed War. They were taught to be American, not Modoc. Then came the slow burn of recognition for the Modoc of Oklahoma, those who had survived the Trail of Tears westward, buried their warriors and raised children in alien dust. The fight for federal recognition became their war without arrows. For decades, they were labeled as terminated, a bureaucratic death sentence that meant no land, no benefits, no rights. It was as if the US government had signed their erasure into being with a pen. But the Modoc do not vanish. In 1978, after years of organizing, demanding, pleading, and proving, the Modoc tribe of Oklahoma was officially restored to federal recognition. It did not return everything that was taken, but it meant the right to exist. Legally, it meant they were no longer invisible. It meant they could claim resources, protect culture, and stand again under their name. Recognition was not just a political act. It was spiritual. It was the first time in generations that a government said, "We see you, we name you, We admit that we tried to erase you and failed. Meanwhile, in Northern California, the Klamath Modoc-Yahuskan peoples, who had intermarried and survived together under pressure, were also beginning to reassert identity. Though many had lost land to the disastrous Klamath Termination Act of 1954, they refused to disappear. Elders told stories, youth joined councils. The dream of return was not buried. Only sleeping dot land came slowly. Parcels, tracks, negotiated corners of old memory. The Modoc people didn't get the lava beds back. Not officially. That sacred scarred landscape is now a national monument. But they return there. They walk the paths of their ancestors. They speak prayers among the rock towers. And they tell their children, this was where our warriors vanished into the earth and reappeared, like smoke through casino revenue, grants, and sheer determination. The Oklahoma Modoc built a tribal complex. They opened businesses, launched education programs, started language revitalization. It was not a perfect homecoming. Many still felt the ache of exile, but it was something sacred, stability, a center, a voice that no longer needed permission to speak. And yet, the struggle continued. Who was really Modoc? Could a tribe split by geography still share one soul? Were those born in Oklahoma less authentic than those who remained near Tule Lake? These were not easy questions, but they were better than silence. Recognition brought benefits, yes, but it also brought mirrors. And in those mirrors, the tribe saw itself wounded, divided, resilient, rising. In 2016, the Oklahoma Modoc tribe made headlines by becoming the first tribe to legally assist with animal welfare law enforcement across state lines. It was a quiet moment, no drums, no feathers, but it showed something deeper. The tribe was no longer only surviving history, it was shaping the future. The lava beds still whisper. The wind still carries the names of warriors and mothers. And now, at last, those echoes are not only memory, they are policy, they are tribal IDs, they are lines in grant applications and syllables in legal acts. They are fire carved into law, but laws are not enough to return. Truly is to reclaim the spirit, not just the paperwork. That is what the next chapter will carry. The songs, the stones, the soil, the Modoc are walking back, not into history, but into the sacred now. The next step isn't recognition from Washington, it's remembering themselves. The rocks do not forget, even now. If you walk the twisted spires and sun-blasted trenches of the lava beds, you might feel it. A hush that isn't silence, a breath that isn't wind. This is where a people once vanished into stone, not as ghosts, but as memory made flesh. This is Modoc land, not because any treaty says so, not because any court returned it, but because it still speaks their name in the echoes of heat and ashdot. What remains of a people who were hunted, divided, relocated, renamed, everything. They carry obsidian in their blood, sharp, ancient, unbroken. They carry names once made illegal, now tattooed on the hearts of grandchildren. They carry recipes whispered in kitchens, dances resurrected from fragments, languages spoken like spells in small classrooms and sacred fires. And they carry questions, hard ones. Who are we now? What does it mean to be Modoc in a world that once outlawed being Modoc? In Oklahoma, the Modoc tribe builds businesses, runs schools, and prints enrollment cards. There's broadband internet on land where buffalo once roamed. Kids learn both coding and basket weaving. Some walk the halls of universities. Others walk the old powwow circles in ceremony. They are building forward with what little was left, and with all they are rediscovering. In California, descendants keep vigil near the lava. Some are part of the Klamath tribes. Some live outside reservation walls, carrying stories like smoldering embers. At dawn, they walk the trails barefoot. At night, they dream of a homeland never truly lost, only waiting. And everywhere, in both places, in all directions, there is a shared ache and a quiet power. They carry Captain Jack's defiance, not just the war, but the reason for it. Not just the rifles, but the refusal. His last words still echo. My heart is sick, but I will not surrender. That spirit lives in every vote cast, every petition signed, every drum beat carved into modern time, today. The Modoc are artists, veterans, lawyers, weavers, teachers, and dancers. Some never knew the word Modoc until adulthood. Others were born into it like a heartbeat. But now, the identity is not something forced. It is something chosen, rebuilt, remembered. Even their contradictions, a sacred Oklahoma or Oregon, casino boardroom or sweat lodge, military veteran or water protector, all of it is real. All of it belongs, and they are not done. Young Modoc voices are writing books. Some are turning old war stories into graphic novels, into VR experiences, into museum exhibitions. Others are learning to sew regalia their great-grandmothers never got to wear, reclaiming beauty from silence. Every act is a letter, not to the past, but to the next 100 years. To be Modoc is no longer just about survival. It's about creation. This is a generation that honors the trauma, but refuses to be trapped in it. They know what was done. They name it, but they also ask, what can we do now? They teach their children that the lava beds are not just where blood was spilled, but where ancestors whispered the way home. They teach them that being Modoc is not a costume or a weekend. Identity, it's a commitment to land, to truth, to each other. So now, let's imagine this last chapter, not as an ending, but as a letter. From them, from the people beneath the mountain's breath. A letter carved in obsidian and memory. A letter that says, we are still here, we have always been here. And we carry everything, fire, language, dust, song, defiance, and dream, into tomorrow. This is not the close of our story. It's the page before the next fire is lit. The Oglala Sioux once dreamed on the backs of horses and prayed to visions in the sky. They fought the US Army to a standstill and still lost their world. Today, they survive on lands stripped of buffalo, but not of pride. This is the story of a people who once spoke to thunder and now speak for the forgotten. Before the settlers, before the rifles and the railroads, before the treaties that broke more than promises, there was only wind, fire, earth, and sky, and the sky sang. In the beginning, the Lakota say, we were star people, children of the cosmos. Our ancestors came from the Pleiades, guided by light and memory, not by maps. They say the stars spoke a name that drifted down to the earth like snow, Oglala. It meant to scatter one's own, not in chaos, but like seeds across sacred ground, scattered, yes, but always reaching for the sun. We lived in rhythm with the sky. When it cracked open with lightning, we listened. When it wept, we gave thanks. When it burned with morning color, we knew another day had chosen us. The Oglala weren't just a people. We were part of the land's breath. The buffalo were our brothers. The rivers carried not just water but spirit. Everything had a song. and every song was a story of who we were. Grandmothers told of the Wakiya, the thunder beings who lived in the west and rode storm clouds with glowing eyes. Children were taught to whisper their names in the wind, hoping to be noticed. Ceremony wasn't separate from life, it was life. The first breath a child took was sacred. The first step, the first dream, the first time they saw the stars on their own. All sacred. The WIIA, Aweka, or holy men, said the world was made of circles. The sky is a circle, the moon is a circle. Our lodges were circles. Our stories too always returned to their beginning. The Oglala believed no man could own land, because land was not a thing, it was a being, a teacher, a mother, a memory. Mountains were elders. The wind carried warnings. Even silence had meaning. One could go days without speaking and still be filled with knowing. In the Black Hills Bahar Sapa, the heart of everything that is our prayers rose like smoke, curling upward to join the sky that first gave us our name. But the greatest mystery wasn't above, it was inside. The Lakota taught their children that truth does not shout. It arrives slowly, like an animal in the distance. You sit still, you wait, you listen. That's how we learned the land. That's how we learned ourselves. When the first horses came, we called them sundogs. They moved like thunder and breathed like winter. Our people transformed. Riders were no longer men, they were part of the wind. We could travel the vast plains, not just with speed, but with purpose, too. Follow the herds, to meet distant relatives, to dance beside other fires. But even with new power, the center of who we were never changed. We were Oglala. We lived by balance. We died with honor. And we believed that every moment was a piece of the sacred. Long before we were labeled as a tribe, we were a relationship between stars and soil, between dreams and drumbeats, between children and ancestors. The very word Oglala wasn't a badge. It was a promise that no matter how scattered we became, our spirits would always find their way back to the stories, back to the stars. In winter, when the blizzards howled like wolves, our elders painted stories in smoke. They told us how the first Oglala made fire with no flame, only a song. They reminded us that every sunrise was a gift we hadn't earned, but had to honor. And when the wind whispered differently, sharper, colder, more unsure, we knew something was coming. Not a storm, but a shaking, a change. Before history wrote us down in past tense, we were already watching the horizon. We didn't fear the unknown, we respected it. But even the wind that had once carried our name now began to sound unfamiliar. Strangers would come, with papers instead of prayers, with fences instead of feathers. And yet, even then, the sky did not forget us. The name it sang is still there. You just have to listen when the world is quiet. You just have to lie on your back in the tall grass and look up long enough. It's faint now, but it's not gone. The Lakota do not just walk across the earth. We walk between worlds, north, south, east, west. Each direction holds a spirit, a color, a lesson. To move without honoring them is to be lost, even if you think you know the path. The Oglala people say that before a child takes their place in the circle of life, they must first understand where they come from. Not just their family, not just their land, but the directions that shape every breath. East is yellow, the color of the rising sun, of beginnings, of vision. It's where the eagle flies, where children open their eyes for the first time. South is red, full of warmth, growth, and learning. It is the direction of summer, of joy, of youthful strength. West is black not because it's bad, but because it is the place of endings, of mystery, of dreams. That is where the buffalo walk, where the sun sets, where one goes to speak to ancestors. And north is white, the color of wisdom and winter. It is the testing ground, the long night, the place where truth is sharpened. The Oglala believe a person must walk all four directions, not just once but over and over, throughout life. And in the center of that sacred compass is Wakantonka, the Great Spirit, the unknowable, the everywhere, the everything. There is a story still told, especially in winter, when the world quiets and dreams grow louder. It is the story of a boy. He was not strong, he was not fast. He did not throw a spear like his brothers. He did not sing loudly like the others. But he watched, and he listened. One night, while sleeping beneath a sky soaked in stars, he dreamed of the sun. In the dream, the sun did not burn. It spoke. It told him to follow the four directions, not just with his feet, but with his soul. It told him he would be tested by beasts of shadow, tempted by the spirit of false pride, and challenged by silence itself. And when he awoke, he did not tell anyone. He just began walking to the east. He met a bird with wings that shimmered like fire. It told him, see not with your eyes, but with your knowing. To the south, he danced with children made of wind. They laughed and pulled at his hands, whispering, grow wild, be joyful, forget the world's heavy shoes. In the west, he stood before a great buffalo who was weeping. Its tears became stars. The boy asked, why do you cry? The buffalo said, because I remember. And then he turned to the north. There, the wind cut like knives. His skin cracked. His voice vanished. He sat in silence, unmoving. Days passed. But in the stillness, he heard something. Not a word, not a sound, but a deep pulse, the beat of the world. He returned to his people, not taller, not louder, but different. He built a circle of stones. He painted 4 lines in the dirt, and he sat in the middle. People came, they laughed, then they watched, then they listened. They began to remember what their grandparents had told them long ago, that the path to power does not start with shouting. It begins in stillness, in dreaming, in walking the sacred circle again and again. No matter how far you think you've come, this boy whose name is now forgotten became the first walker, a sacred guide. He reminded the people that the world outside is only a mirror of the world within, that each of us carries the 4 directions in our chest, that to truly live is not to chase but to listen. Even today, in Pine Ridge and beyond, the sacred circle remains, painted in regalia, danced in powwows, dreamed in ceremony. Elders teach children to respect the 4 winds, to greet each sunrise with gratitude, to see the seasons not just as weather, but as teachers. The boy who dreamed the sun became many boys, many girls, a people who still look to the sky for guidance, who still know the meaning of shadow and song. The Lakota way is not a path that ends. It spirals, it returns, it reminds. And now, as we move forward in this story, we turn from stars and spirits to something more earthly but just as sacred. We step into the homes made of bark, hide, and fire, into the rhythm of life before the storm, before the broken promises, before the long sorrow, before they came to take the land. We walk next into the warmth of family, the smell of stew, the wisdom of bark and hearth, to the Oglala Sioux home. was not for walls and a roof. It was movement, rhythm, wind. It was the tippy 12 to 16 poles tied at the top, like fingers in prayer, wrapped in buffalo hide, facing east to greet the morning. These homes were never just shelters. They were sacred. They were stories standing tall against the sky. Each tipi was its own small world, yet part of a larger circle, just as every person was part of the Oyayate, the people. Villages were arranged in wide, deliberate rings, open toward the east, in harmony with the four directions. This was not architecture. This was belief. Every part of Oglala life flowed in circles. The seasons, the moons, the gatherings, the dances, the pipe ceremonies. Life was a loop, not a line. Inside the tipi, smoke curled toward the sky through a hole left open at the top. The fire in the center was more than warmth. It was the beating heart of the home. Around it, stories were told, food was shared, decisions were made. Men and women sat in balance, children nestled between laughter and tradition. The air carried more than just the smell of buffalo. It carried language, teaching, memory. Women were the keepers of the home, not because they were lesser, but because they were life-bringers. They erected the tipis, packed the homes, and carried the community from one hunting ground to the next. Their strength was not loud, it was woven into every day, every gesture, every glance. Oglala women were the ones who decided whether to strike the tipi poles into the ground or pull them up and move on. The tipi itself told a story. Its poles represented the connection between earth and sky. Its shape echoed the womb, and its smoke flap was like the breath of the home run, carrying prayers to the Creator. Boys learned to respect it, to treat it not as a place to crash, but a living space, alive with song, sacred with spirit, out on the plains. The Oglala followed the Buffalo Totinka Oyat, the Buffalo Nation. Every part of the buffalo was used, meat for food, hide for homes and clothing, bones for tools. But it wasn't just use, it was gratitude, ritual, relationship. Before a hunt, the men smoked the sacred pipe and prayed. When a buffalo fell, they spoke to its spirit. Thank you, brother. We do not take you lightly. Children were not scolded, but guided. They learned through watching, copying, listening. A boy would crouch beside his uncle to carve a bow. A girl would sit beside her grandmother to scrape a hide. Discipline came through the circle, not punishment, but reflection. A mistake was a thread that had slipped, it could be woven if one was honest and humble, and always the circle guided it all. The elders taught that everything returns. What you give, you receive. What you break, you must repair. The tipi, the village, the ceremonies, even the dreams all moved in circular motion. Winter stories passed to spring ceremonies. Summer dances gave way to autumn gratitude. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. There was time. There was trust. There was rhythm. But on the edge of that circle, change was coming. The Oglala began to hear whispers about settlers, soldiers, strangers who didn't understand circles. They came with fences, maps, rules, with paper that claimed what could not be claimed, with railroads and rifles, with square houses and straight lines. The tipi was seen as primitive, nomadic life as inconvenient, the circle as dangerous, but still the smoke rose. Still the women tied their bundles with ceremony. Still the elders sang prayers to the east. The circle may have bent, but it did not break. To this day, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the circle still lives, in ceremonies, in language classes, in the eyes of the grandmothers who remember what it meant to watch the stars through the smoke hole of a tipi. Young people tattooed the symbol of the four directions onto their arms, not as fashion, but as memory, as defiance, because no matter what came next, they would carry the circle with them, and what came next was blood and betrayal, and flags that came with treaties that shattered like bone under steel. The storms were gathering, and in the middle of it stood a proud people with feathers in their hair and fire in their hearts. The hunters would ride, the warriors would rise, the drums would call for survival, and history would be rewritten in HOOFBEATS. A storm does not ask permission before it breaks. It roars, it rides, it strikes. So did the Oglala Sioux. When danger came, they didn't whisper, they mounted thunder. They painted their horses with handprints, with prayers, with the breath of their ancestors. And they rode into history not as victims, but as wind-carved warriors who knew the cost of freedom. To be Oglala was to be part of a code not one written on paper, but in blood, spirit, and wind. Boys didn't learn bravery from books. They learned it from scars, from tracking elk through snowfields, from watching their fathers ride toward danger without looking back. Courage wasn't just admired, it was expected, because every warrior carried more than a weapon. He carried the weight of a people. The horse was more than an animal. It was an extension of the self. Oglala boys were placed on ponies before they could speak in full sentences. The bond between rider and horse was sacred. When a man painted lightning bolts down his pony's legs, he was calling upon speed, spirit, storm. Some even whispered to their horses before battle, not commands, but promises. If I fall, run to my people, tell them I fought. War itself was never senseless. It had rules, boundaries, spirit. The Oglala did not fight for greed. They fought for survival, for honor, for revenge only when revenge was righteous. They believed that every warrior's actions echoed into the spirit world. A brave man who fought with dignity would find his place among the stars. A cruel one might wander the afterlife forever, unclaimed. Before battle, there were rituals, smudging with sage to cleanse fear, songs to steady the heartbeat. The sacred pipe passed from hand to hand. No war cry was just noise. It was the song of ancestors rising through the throat. And when the Oglala charged, they did not scatter. They flowed, like buffalo, like thunder. Weapons were handmade and personal. A bow wasn't just strung when it carried prayers. A lance might have a feather from a vision quest. Some carried coup stick symbols of the bravest act a warrior could do. Touch the enemy and live. Killing was not always the goal. Honor was, balance was, but it was never only men who showed courage. Oglala women defended the camp, protected the children, even rode into battle when needed. The warrior spirit didn't come with agenda. It came with fire, with duty, with bloodline. Stories passed down speak of men who wore wolf pelts into war, of horses who returned home alone, of dream visions where warriors met the white buffalo calf woman and learned humility. Some say certain warriors were protected by spirit animals, hawks that screamed before danger, or snakes that curled around their dreams. And yet, behind every fierce face was grief. A warrior might cry alone in the woods, might braid his fallen brother's hair and bury it in the earth. There was space in the code for mourning, for silence, for tears that only the wind heard. But as rifles replaced bows, as generals replaced chiefs, and wagons rolled across the land like crawling scars. The warrior code was tested. The US government called them hostiles. Newspapers said they were savages. But what they really were guardians, protectors of a world the world wanted to erase. Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, these names weren't just leaders. They were mountains in motion, men who refused to sign away their souls, who fought knowing the battle might be lost, but the spirit must live. When they rode, the sky watched. When they spoke, the trees leaned in. They were more than warriors. They were memory keepers. Even now, the code lives. Young Oglala boys learned to braid their hair, not for fashion, but for pride. To ride, not for show, but to feel that old pulse in the saddle. Lakota veterans return home from modern wars, still carrying those sacred values: honor, sacrifice, protection of the people. And the horse remains. Every Sundance, every ride across Pine Ridge, echoes that thunder still, because no matter what was taken, languish land lives. The warrior code could not be stolen. It is bone deep, spirit sealed, and the blood trails of the past still speak. If you ride quietly enough, next comes the moment where that blood met ink. When warriors tried to trade weapons for words, when signatures were asked for, but lies were written instead. Some names don't need statues. They live in the air, in the dust that follows wild horses, in the wind that sings over the black hills. Crazy Horse was never photographed. He signed no treaties. He held no title. And yet, he became the soul of a nation. Not because he ruled, but because he refused to bow. They called him Taisonk Witko, and to his people, he wasn't crazy. He was lightning wrapped in a man. His dreams were not made of gold or blood or land, but of freedom. He moved through the world like a shadow on horsebacks, swift and impossible to catch. He dreamed of a Lakota world untouched by white flags and railroad lines. He believed in a land where the children could still hear the language of the earth. The stories say he was born beneath a strange sky. That thunder cracked the night his spirit arrived. His vision came early, standing beneath a ridge, staring into the flame-colored horizon. He saw a man who would never be touched by bullets, never wear war paint, never seek glory. That man was himself. And from then on, he walked the earth like a prophecy. He wore no feathers. He didn't dance before battle, but when he rode, the earth felt it. His horse knew only one direction forward. His people followed, not because he asked, but because he embodied what they feared they were losing. A future where Lakota breath still meant something. Crazy Horse fought, not out of hate, but heartbreak. He saw what others didn't. The slow unraveling, the treaties soaked in lies, the missionaries with clipped smiles, the bison skulls stacked like pyramids. He saw the ghost of what was coming, and he made the wind his witness at Little Bighorn. When the sky cracked open and Custer fell, it was Crazy Horse's strategy, his fire, that lit the victory. But he did not dance afterward. He did not boast. He simply rode away, because his fight was never for revenge, was for remembrance. They say his horse moved like smoke, that he could ride through bullets and not be touched, that his enemies feared not just his presence, but his silence. He didn't speak unless it mattered, and when he did, his words were like stone, few, heavy, unmovable. But dreams cannot outrun fences. In the end, it wasn't a battle that broke him. It was betrayal, a promise made with poisoned breath. In 1877, when he was told to come in and speak his truth, they waited with shackles. They stabbed him in the back, literally bayonet to the fort that claimed to offer peace. He fell not in war, but in the shadow of it. And yet, even as he died, his lips held secrets. No one knows where he was buried. His resting place remains a mystery, a final act of protection from a man who knew that even in death, some things must remain. Unclaimed today, his monument rises not from marble but from mountain, a carving in progress, vast and slow, chiseled into South Dakota stone. But even that, massive as it is, feels too small, because Crazy Horse never needed to be seen to be felt. He lives in protest marches on Pine Ridge, in the dreams of boys who braid their hair and look to the horizon, in elders who whisper his name when storms roll over the plains, and in the silence between drumbeats where memory lingers. Like smoke, he didn't want to be famous. He wanted his people to be free, and maybe that's why his dream still moves through the hills, whispering to those who listen, do not be tamed, do not be bought. Remember who you are, and if you stand still enough on certain Lakota nights, you might just hear it, the hoofbeats of a man made of storm, still riding. The paper came down from Washington like snow that burned. They called it a treaty, but it felt like smoke creeping from the north, curling through Tippis, choking dreams before they even woke. It was the kind of smoke that didn't rise from a sacred fire. It came from pens and promises and men in coats who never looked the buffalo in the eye. In 1851, they sat the Lakota down at Fort Laramie. Sign here, they said. This land will be yours. And for a moment, there was hope. The boundaries drawn across the map were wide and generous. The Black Hills stayed sacred. The plains still echoed with hooves. But the ink was still wet when the whispers began. Gold, railroads, settlers, and just like that, the map began to bleed. By 1868, they returned, this time with harder eyes and tighter hands. Another treaty, this one forged from betrayal. It promised peace, but only after carving the Lakota world into a fenced silence. Yes, the Black Hills remained untouched on paper, but within a decade, white miners flooded in like ants to sugar. They dug into the sacred heart of the Lakota world and called it progress, what the Lakota called Pahasapa, the beating heart of the earth, became claims, companies, and gold fever. The hills were more than mountains. They were stories, prayers, the burial places of ancestors. To desecrate them was to tear pages from a sacred book. And yet the soldiers came. Forts rose. Wagons rolled in, and no treaty, no line, no signature held them back. It wasn't just land that was taken. It was the spirit of a people, the right to hunt where the wind led, the right to ride without a permit, the right to decide when and how their children would be taught. Every new signature from the government felt like a blade slicing into language, into law, into the very idea of Lakota sovereignty. Some resisted with rifles, others resisted with silence. Elders turned their backs on federal agents. Children were hidden during census counts. Prayers were whispered in cellars. Ceremonies held deep in the woods. Even when treaties were broken, the sacred contract with the earth remained. The irony was sharp. The US government had made more than 500 treaties with native tribes. Every single one was broken or violated. For the Lakota, these treaties were not just lies. They were traps, baited with paper, enforced with gunpowder. And yet, even in that betrayal, the people endured. Some leaders tried to walk both roads. They wore suits in Washington, spoke English, negotiated for their people only to be met with closed doors and open-ended lies. Others, like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, chose resistance, not because they wanted war, but because they wanted their grandchildren to still see the stars without fences. Today, the broken treaties live on as scars and lawsuits. In 1980, the US Supreme Court admitted that the Black Hills were taken illegally. They offered money. The Lakota refused. Because land isn't something you sell, it's something you sing to, something you bury your dead in, something that remembers your name. The smoke still lingers in school textbooks. Treaties are footnotes. In Lakota homes, they are funeral songs. They are stories whispered to children about how a signature can steal a mountain, how a line on a page can echo louder than a rifle, and how a people made of wind and fire refuse to vanish. The treaty did not break the Lakota. It tried. It tore at the edges of their world. But deep inside, the fire held. And from that fire came songs, protests, lawsuits, and warriors with cell phones and court documents. The paper cut deep. Yes, but the wound did not become silence. It became thunder. The snow fell soft, but the silence screamed. December 29th, 1890, on the frozen edge of South Dakota, the Lakota people gathered, not for war, not to raise weapons, but to survive the winter, to pray, to move with dignity toward something like peace. They had surrendered their rifles. They were cold, exhausted, many sick. They wrapped themselves in buffalo robes and in hope. Some still wore the ghost shirts, thin and handmade, stitched with belief that bullets would not pierce. Spirit, the soldiers came anyway. It started with a scuffle, a deaf man named Black Coyote who didn't want to give up his gun. He couldn't hear the shouting, but the soldiers didn't wait. In a breath, the meadow became a grave. Bullets rained like judgment. Children fell first. Women ran and were cut down. The rifles cracked without rhythm, without pause, and the snow turned red. They called it a battle. It was not. It was a massacre. Nearly 300 Lakota, many of them unarmed, many of them women and children, were slaughtered. Some tried to run. Some crawled for safety beneath wagons, into the arms of loved ones already gone. But the soldiers hunted even the breath. Ghosts were born that day. Ghosts that still walk the plains. Ghosts that still whisper in the wind. Ghosts that ask one simple question: why? The ghost dance had terrified the US government. A spiritual movement. Born of desperation, it swept through reservations with sacred speed. Lakota danced to awaken ancestors, to restore the buffalo, to bring back the old world where their children laughed in grass and not in schoolhouses built on erasure. They danced not for war, but for return, for memory, for a world untouched by railroads and reservation lines. To the government, that was rebellion. To the Lakota, it was medicine. The US Army sent thousands of troops to contain the threat. Sitting Bull was killed days before the massacre, shot in his own camp by native police working under federal orders. Trust had vanished. Panic filled the spaces where peace once tried to grow. When the shooting stopped at Wounded Knee, the bodies were left in the snow, frozen where they fell. A storm rolled in that night, not metaphor, but real, cruel wind. Survivors, wounded and bleeding, lay for hours beneath the open sky. It took days to bury the dead. They dug a mass grave and shoveled in history. 20 soldiers were given medals of honor. The Lakota were given silence. Yet Wounded Knee did not end the story. It carved something into the soul of a people that could not be erased. A scar, yes, but also a vow. Decades passed. Names changed. The world forgot. But in 1973, Wounded Knee rose again. This time, not in prayer robes, but with rifles and demands. Members of the American Indian movement occupied the site. For 71 days, they stood in the very spot where their ancestors had fallen, and they said, "No more." That was the moment the ghost became a voice. And even now, elders say the snow there still sings, that on certain nights, you can feel the ancestors walking. That Wounded Knee is not a place of death, but of return, of reckoning, of remembering. Today, the name Wounded Knee does not appear bold in textbooks, but to the Oglala Lakota, it is a name burned into every breath, a reminder that even when the snow falls quietly, it can bury a nation's scream. And yet still they rose. The ghost shirts did not stop the bullets, but the dream behind them never died. It dances still. The silence was not peace. It was stolen speech in the heart of America's boarding schools. Far from the drumbeat of home and the lullabies of grandmothers, Lakota children sat in rows, uniformed, renamed, reshaped. Their braids were cut, their languages forbidden. The walls didn't echo with stories, but with the ringing bell of obedience. And through it all, a quiet settled in their bones, not from calm, but from erasure. They were taken young, sometimes 5 years old, sometimes younger. Government agents arrived with wagons and cold eyes, waving papers and promises. Parents were told it was for education, but the truth was darker. The schools were meant to kill the Indian, save the man. That was the motto carved into desks. And discipline. Carlisle, Genoa, Chilocco, Holy Rosary on Pine Ridge. The names changed, but the mission did not. Lakota boys were taught how to farm, to saw wood, to be janitors of someone else's world. Girls learned to sew, to scrub, to bow their heads and swallow their names. They were taught geography, but never of the Black Hills. They were taught history, but never of Crazy Horse. They were taught English, but never allowed Lakota. If they spoke their language, they were beaten. If they cried for home, they were mocked. If they dreamed too loudly, they were shamed. The punishments were quiet and cruel. Mouths scrubbed with lye, solitary confinement, public whippings. But perhaps the worst wound was internal. The growing belief that to be Lakota was wrong, that their own songs were childish, that their ancestors were primitive, that assimilation was survival, and so many children folded into silence. Some children never returned. Graveyards still lie behind those old brick buildings, unmarked, overgrown. Hundreds of small bodies never returned to families. Some died from disease, some from hunger, some from heartbreak. The records have faded, the truth scattered like ashes, but the grief that remains. And yet inside that silence, small rebellions lived at night. Under bedsheets or out in the fields, children whispered Lakota words to each other like smuggled treasure. Older students taught younger ones songs they could never sing aloud. They hid pieces of who they were deep inside, behind their eyes, waiting for the day they could bring them home. Some did, others never could. Decades later, survivors began to speak. Their voices were soft at first, trembling, hesitant, but with each telling, the silence broke more. Testimonies emerged, truths were unearthed. Elders began to name the pain, and the tribe began to listen, not just to the stories of survival, but to the echoes of children who never made it out. Today, the Oglala Sioux are reclaiming what the schools tried to take. Language programs revive Lakota syllables in schools that belong to the people, not the Bureau. Ceremonies are held to remember the children lost, to bless the children now. Healing centers help elders process the trauma passed down like unspoken inheritance. And young people are rising, speaking fluent Lakota, singing old songs with new strength, walking into classrooms no longer afraid of their own shadow, but the scars are still there. Some families don't speak the language anymore, not out of choice, but because a great-grandfather was beaten for it. Some don't tell stories at night, not out of neglect, but because once stories were silenced. This is the aftershock. The silence passed through generations. To understand the strength of the Oglala Sioux today, we must understand what they survived in secret. Not just battles and bullets, but chalkboards and scissors. Not just war, but forced forgetting. And they did not forget. They carried their culture in their marrow. The silence of boarding schools was meant to end a people. Instead, it gave birth to the warriors of memory. History doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it screams through the cracks of broken treaties and government lies. And in 1973, the Oglala Lakota people stopped whispering. It began in Pine Ridge, a reservation cracked by poverty, corruption, and fear. Tribal chairman Dick Wilson, backed by federal funding, ruled like a dictator. His private militia, the Goon Squad, guardians of the Oglala Nation, roamed with rifles, targeting political enemies, often traditionalists, often elders. Voices of dissent vanished into jail cells or graveyards. The FBI turned away. The system had no ears for Lakota pain. But the American Indian movement, AIM, had fire in its lungs. Founded in Minneapolis in 1968 by urban native activists, AIM was born from outrage against police brutality, broken promises, and cultural annihilation. But by the time it reached Pine Ridge, it had evolved into something older and deeper. A resurrection of warrior spirit. A storm wrapped in the memory of ancestors. A call to remember who they were before reservations, and to act like it. On February 27, 1973, that storm arrived in Wounded Knee, the same place where 83 years earlier, Lakota men, women, and children had been massacred by US soldiers. Now, 200 AIM members, traditional Lakotas, and their supporters took the village, guns in hand, spirits awake, flags of the old Lakota nation, flying above barricades made of scrap metal and sandbags. Their demand was simple: investigate the corruption on Pine Ridge, reopen treaty negotiations, let the world hear what the government had tried to bury. Washington called it an uprising. Lakota people called it remembering. For 71 days, Wounded Knee was surrounded by FBI agents, US Marshals, and armored vehicles. Snipers crept through the hills, helicopters circled, power was cut, food was blockaded. Gunfire echoed at night like ghosts unsettled. Inside, it wasn't just a siege, it was ceremony. Women boiled coffee over fires. Men recited old songs before sleeping. Young warriors cleaned their rifles beside elders telling stories of Crazy Horse. The sacred pipe was smoked. The sacred fire never went out, and the world watched. Reporters, celebrities, and international activists poured in. For the first time in generations, the US was forced to look the Lakota in the eye. And what they saw wasn't a rebellion. It was a nation still alive, but it came at a cost. 2 native men were killed. Dozens were wounded. Hundreds were arrested. When the siege ended in May, Wounded Knee was rubble, and Pine Ridge descended into bloodshed. Over 60 unsolved murders of native people followed in the next 3 years. The goon squads, backed by federal silence, hunted AIM members like prey. And yet, the memory of those 71 days wouldn't die. The siege didn't win back the Black Hills. It didn't bring down corrupt leaders, but it did something just as dangerous. It reminded a people they had teeth. AIM awakened a generation. It gave young Lakota a reason to be proud again, not for what they had lost, but for what still lived in their bones. It spoke the unspeakable, that the United States had never honored its promises. That resistance was not just justified, it was sacred. Today, the legacy of Wounded Knee 1973 is carried in songs, in t-shirts, in documentaries, and in the fierce eyes of elders who stood their ground. The siege was not the end of suffering, but it was the beginning of a new kind of war. One fought not just with rifles, but with stories, lawsuits, and stubborn, surviving culture. What AIM reminded the world was this, that the Lakota are not a footnote in someone else's textbook. They are the storm on the hill, the blood that refused to forget, the warriors who do not kneel, and they are still here. There are places in America where the roads crack like old skin and the water runs brown, if it runs at all. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, these aren't symbols, they are survival. Pine Ridge is one of the poorest counties in the United States. It's not a statistic, it's a sentence etched into every gravel road, every boarded-up home, every school with half the funding and double the trauma. Most families live below the poverty line. Entire neighborhoods share one working faucet. Some homes have no electricity, no insulation, no running water. In the winter, the cold comes in through the floor. In the summer, the heat peels the paint off memory, but the Oglala Lakota people have always made nations from dust. They were once the horse lords of the plains, riders whose freedom stretched from horizon to horizon. Now, that same spirit survives on back roads, where the nearest grocery store might be an hour away, and the word reservation doesn't mean safety, it means limits. The people here don't need metaphors to explain injustice. They can point to the cancer in the water, the black mold in the school walls, the teenage suicides that come too often and too young. Yet in every trailer lit by candles, in every community hall where elders speak through tears, there's something more powerful than pain: persistence. Res roads might be made of potholes and forgotten promises, but they're also pathways to ceremony. Every few miles, there's a sweat lodge, a drum circle, a grandmother teaching a child to speak Lakota again. Language classes are held in basements. Boys still tie tobacco ties before they pray. Girls dance in jingle dresses stitched by hand. Where the system failed, culture stepped in, and the youth, the ones who should have broken, are rebuilding. They turn rap lyrics into language preservation. They wear ribbon skirts to protests. They turn trauma into poetry, basketball into survival, TikTok into activism. They talk about boarding schools and suicide and alcoholism with honesty that would silence Congress. And they're not ashamed. They are not the at-risk children the outside world sees. They are warriors reborn with cameras instead of guns, with skateboards instead of spears. They carry the scars of genocide, and they keep walking. What no census can measure is how many times Lakota women have held families together through droughts of love and money. How many uncles dig ditches for free to keep their neighbors' pipes from freezing? How many aunties drive hours just to bring a kid to school? These aren't acts of charity. They're the old law of the people: kinship, responsibility, resilience. There are no movie cameras here, no politicians shaking hands for votes, just the quiet defiance of people who refuse to be erased. And still, the betrayals come. Federal programs promise but delay. Developers dig pipelines without permission. Churches try to save what they never understood. But the Lakota don't flinch. They organize, they march, they testify. And when the law ignores them, they go back to the land, to the stories, too. The songs that outlast governments, because the spirit of Pine Ridge is not just in resistance. It's in adaptation. It's in a father teaching his son to bead by candlelight when the power's out. It's in a girl who brings fry bread to a friend who's grieving. It's in the laughter after funerals, the powwow that shakes the dust. From old Pain, the elder who remembers every star's name and still prays for everyone, even the ones who forgot them. The pipes may be broken, the roads may crumble, but the people do not dot. To outsiders, Pine Ridge is often painted in tragedy. But to those who live there, it's a place of sacred survival, a place where history breathes in everyday things, where a broken trailer can still house hope, and where being Lakota isn't something that was taken, it's something that continues, step by step, down a road no empire can destroy. And now we follow that road deeper, past the headlines, past the pain, into the hearts of the next generation who are writing a new future in the very dust that once tried to bury them. They returned not as shadows, but as thunder. The buffalo once nearly wiped from the face of the plains are running again. Their hooves break open. Old silence. Their breath steams into sky like prayers. For the Lakota, their return is not just ecological, it's spiritual, it's political, it's prophecy fulfilled. To understand what this means, you must know what was lost at one time. Millions of bison roamed this land, not animals, but relatives. They fed the people, clothed them, taught them. Every part of the buffalo had purpose. Horns became spoons, hide became shelter, bones became tools, and spirit became ceremony. Then the guns came. The US Army and government-backed hunters slaughtered the buffalo with industrial cruelty, not just to starve a people, but to erase their way of life. Mountains of skulls were stacked like trophies. What had once been abundance became a long, aching absence. The Lakota survived, but something sacred went quiet until now. In recent years, buffalo herds have returned to Lakota lands, not through chance, but through grit, through community-led efforts, tribal biologists, and spiritual leaders who never stopped praying. Now, children who once saw bison only in books watch them graze behind fences built with ceremony. And the elders say, the buffalo are teaching us again. This isn't nostalgia. It's revolution. Buffalo herds bring food sovereignty, fresh meat instead of canned rations. They teach youth about responsibility, cycles, and respect. But more than that, they connect the people back to themselves. Every buffalo born is a memory reborn. Every buffalo hunt, done with prayer, not conquest, is a living act of healing. And it's not just the animals returning. It's the language, the ceremony, the stories. Lakota immersion schools are blooming like wildflowers. In classrooms once filled with silence, kids now chant verb endings. They laugh in Lakota. They rap in Lakota. They dream in Lakota. It's not perfect, no revival is, but it's real. And it's powered by grandmothers, uncles, and teachers who understand that to lose the language is to lose the mirror of the soul. Language is how land recognizes you. It's how prayers are sent correctly, how kinship is kept clean, how history survives in breath, not just books. But this revival doesn't look like a museum. It looks like YouTube channels teaching Lakota verbs. It sounds like podcasts where elders share visions. It flashes across TikTok, where teens dance in regalia under neon filters. These are the new digital fires, screenlit and sacred. Warmth in the algorithmic cold. Technology, once feared as a destroyer, is becoming a bridge. Lakota coders are building language apps. Artists remix ancestral stories into animations. Filmmakers document sweat lodge protocols with drone shots. One young woman teaches beadwork tutorials over livestream. Another uses VR to let users walk through a tipi village. Their message: we are still here, and we are not stuck in the past. The drumbeat of the future is plugged in, uploaded, and deeply rooted. Of course, resistance remains. There are still bureaucrats who question funding, still outsiders who fetishize or mock. But the digital world has created a strange new sovereignty, one where tribes don't have to wait for permission to be heard. They upload, they go viral, they get loud, and when Lakota voices echo across the world, so do their truths. They speak of the land not as property, but as mother, of identity not as DNA, but as responsibility, of sovereignty not as a legal term, but as the right to exist, without apology. In Pine Ridge today, buffalo thunder across the prairie, while kids code their dreams into the cloud. Sacred fires are lit in sweat lodges and server rooms alike. The ancestors are not watching in silence. They are speaking through Wi-Fi, smoke, and song. The Lakota future is not a return. It's a continuation, a remembering that walks. Forward, the buffalo came back. So did the language. So did the people. Now, the stars wait to see what comes next. We are not museum bones. We are not myth. Not vanished smoke or echoes trapped in textbooks. We are breath. We are voices in the wind. We are sacred, not because the world pities us, but because we remember what the world forgot. The Oglala Lakota are still here in Pine Ridge, children. Wake to the songs of grandmothers who survived boarding schools. In sweat lodges, prayers rise like heat through willow frames. Young men braid their hair not for fashion, but for medicine. Elders still walk in both worlds, one foot in the spirit, one in the storm of modernity, keeping the flame from flickering out. For over a century, the world has tried to write our ending. They tried with guns at Wounded Knee, with treaties written in blood and erased in ink, with school books that mocked our stories, with laws that banned our language, with systems that made our homes poor but never broke our honor. But the story did not end. It transformed. We are the people of the pipe, the song, the circle. We are the sunrise on frozen res roads, the defiant laugh of a teen dancing in regalia to the bass line of a powwow beat, the silent resilience of a mother who still teaches her children to speak with the land. We are treaty right fighters, suicide hotline volunteers, language teachers, TikTok warriors, drum carvers, lawyers in braids. We are not extinct. We are sacred. Sacred because our survival was not expected. Sacred because we carry both trauma and prophecy, because our ceremonies did not fade, because our children now dream in a language nearly taken, because even in the darkest winters, when addiction swallowed homes, when heat was a luxury, when elders passed without recognition, we still lit the fire. And now the fire spreads. Tribal colleges grow, youth councils rise, buffalo thunder returns. Our stories are no longer whispered only in teepees. They echo in courtrooms, podcasts, art galleries, and protests. We are building our own future, painted with both scars and stars. Sacred doesn't mean perfect. It means enduring. It means the bones of the old ones still live in our decisions. It means we carry 7 generations on our backs. It means that even if the world forgets our name, we know it was spoken by the sky before any colonizer ever touched the soil. We don't need to be romanticized. We don't need to be saved. We need to be seen as full, as complex, as sovereign, because the world still asks, are they really still here? And we say, yes. In every sunrise over badlands, in every buffalo hunt done with prayer, in every 4-year-old who chants Lakota vowels, in every drumbeat that remembers, in every tear shed for stolen land, in every laugh shared between aunties, at the bingo hall, in every protest, every vote, every ceremony held by moonlight. We are not frozen in time. We are evolving with purpose. We are sacred, not because we belong to the past, but because we are building the next world with the bones of this one. And when the world asks what became of the Lakota, tell them we are the echo that became thunder. Again, tell them we are the breath that kept breathing, even underwater. Tell them we are sacred because we dared to remember when forgetting would have been easier. We are not extinct. We are Oglala. We are still rising, still singing, still dancing barefoot in ceremony, still whispering names to the stars, because they have not forgotten us, and as long as the stars remember, we are never gone. The circle is not broken. The story continues.